Story number one.
I used to think the city's noise would drown out the strange, that if anything unnatural happened within sight of 10,000 windows, it would be swallowed by routine. I was wrong. It wasn't noise I should have feared. It was stillness that learned my name. I believed routines keep you safe. They don't. They teach someone else exactly where to stand. Authority speaks in the grammar of incidents and charges. What unraveled me never fit a form. He never touched me. He never called me. He only rearranged the gravity in my home until all paths tilted toward the windows. I rent a small place that looks into an alley no wider than a bus. Brick on brick. Fire escapes like spinal ladders, cables and clotheslines and warped blinds. The private faces of buildings that pretend to turn away from the street. From my corner desk I can see metal platforms, paint peeled to grey, a tangle of rails that promise rescue but mostly host pigeons and the morning breath of the city. I was good at that angle, the casual cataloguing of what belongs, a mural's blister, a laundry line's sway, the way my own reflection ghosts the glass if I lean close. I knew the whole box of view like a puzzle I'd solved. And I took comfort in that solved feeling the way some people wear a ring. Everything had its habit, even me. I moved like a syllable I had learned to pronounce without thinking.
One day the alley gave me a new word. On the platform across from me, metal grating dark with weather, someone was standing. Not slouching, not scrolling, not stretching a morning ache. Standing, hands in a jacket, cap tight to the brow. The posture was the first trespass. The second was the angle of the head, the way a statue might look if someone taught it what eyes are for. City life trains you not to lock eyes through glass, but I didn't have to lock anything. It felt like the lock had already turned on my side without a key. The stranger faced my window and distilled every sound outside into a hum behind the ribs. I told myself he was maintenance, but I told myself he had a reason to be there other than me. We make these little petitions to our own mind. Let it be normal. Let it be nothing. Let it evaporate if I pretend not to notice. I tested the fiction. I left the chair by the window and took my mug to the kitchen. From there I can still see a sliver of that opposite platform, sliced by pipes and the edge of a duct. The figure adjusted, not by a lot, just enough to reveal the truth hidden inside every small movement. Somebody else had studied my apartment longer than I had studied the alley. He found a new angle that delivered my kitchen like a gift. He knew where I would go when I tried not to be found. My mind went bland and bright, the way fear turns the body into a room with all the doors open. I reminded myself of the city's logic. Platforms are public. People stand and smoke. People wait and think. People drift. Then I timed my breath like a metronome and told myself I could outwait stillness. He wasn't just randomly standing there. He was actively looking for me. I felt the sentence unfurl in me, not as panic, but as law. I started documenting everything: angles, clothing, stance, the precise square of space he claimed. I wrote it all in a notes app, as if detail could fence him in. I photographed the opposite ladder from behind my own dark glass. And in every frame, his stillness contaminated the rest, every brick crisper, because the body on the platform refused to blur. I moved room to room and learned that my apartment wasn't a set of rooms at all. It was a line of sight someone else had measured to the inch. When I lowered a blind, I felt it drop not on a window, but on my throat. I started to wonder what story of me he had already told himself. People don't look at a place like that without having named its inhabitant. The next adjustment came when I reached for my camera with the long lens that makes distance courteous. I wanted a face. Not because I planned to post it or send it or do anything reckless. I wanted a name tag for the fear. The second the strap slid across my shoulder, he folded himself out of view. A vanishing trick done with nothing but railings and posture. That was when I felt the city's practical rules shrug and wander off without me. That's when I realized this wasn't casual observation. This was calculated, experienced stalking. I told a friend, then I told another, then I told the police, who listened as if they were standing at the mouth of a tunnel while I spoke from inside it. Standing on a fire escape isn't illegal, the officer explained. Even if he's looking at your building, paper doesn't recognize a gaze. Paper wants impact. Paper wants a dent in a lock, a boot on a door, a bruise. Paper nods at curtains. Paper says the word routine like it isn't the simplest kind of trap. Curtains went up. I moved my own habits like furniture, inch by inch. And because changing what I did didn't change what I felt. I mounted a tiny black camera in the corner of my window like a false mole on a face. I told myself the lens wasn't a witness so much as a mirror that would return me to the person who had believed the alley was solved. Days passed, or maybe it was only a day, and this is how fear lengthens it. Glue between pages you can't quite open. When I finally checked the memory card, the footage washed my apartment in a cool, numbered light. The alley was a throat. I watched it breathe, and people crossed. Neighbors I only knew by their shoes, a delivery girl, and then the platform held a shape I already knew too well. He was there in the darkness, barely visible, but definitely there. When I crossed my bedroom and light rose behind the blinds, the shape leaned closer to the rail, as if brightness were invitation. My body turned into a diagram on his side of the glass. I didn't sleep, but not because I was afraid of dreams. I was afraid of how the waking would translate them into instructions. The detective who finally took the case gave me a card and an attentive face and the kind of voice that carries a scaffold inside it. She walked the alley with another officer. A pair of flashlights etching temporary gates on brick. Hours later she called with a fact that rearranged every prior fact. That fire escape wasn't connected to any apartment. The door at the end of that platform had been sealed. The last owner had turned the staircase into boiled metal, and the idea of a staircase, whoever watched me hadn't opened a door to get there. He had climbed a negation. This wasn't convenient stalking. He was putting in serious effort to watch me. The detective's name was Martinez, and she said the quiet part that nobody else would let touch air. People who build rituals out of other people escalate. You cannot ask obsession to stop being itself. We need to be proactive. That sounded right. It also sounded like a word for a set of actions whose truest purpose would be to give my hands something to do. So I gave them work. More cameras, new locks, routes bent into curves I didn't used to walk. Nights at a friend's couch offered as much sleep as a theatre seat, but proximity to a known heartbeat calmed the bone-deep shimmer of being observed. The building's manager replaced a basement door that had never quite remembered to latch. The neighbor down the hall agreed to text me when she saw anything odd on the landing. I learned the names attached to the other mailboxes, not to be friendly, though that happened too, but to make the place feel like a place again. A set of humans rather than a grid of vulnerabilities. I let the detective's promised patrols be a sentence I could finish. Someone else would turn the corner first. The note appeared like an answer to a question I had never asked out loud. White paper, folded with neat creases, slid under my door as if whoever left it knew the shape of my footsteps inside. The handwriting looked like it had been practiced in a workbook, upright, careful, each line assembled. New cameras won't stop me from caring about you. I know you're scared, but you don't need to be. I'm protecting you. Reading it didn't make my pulse race, it narrowed it. As if the beat had to pass through a keyhole, the word caring held a distortion of tenderness, a parody of promise. I gave the note to Martinez and watched the words sink into a plastic evidence sleeve until they looked like something from a museum. Artifact of a small religion with one worshipper and one unwilling saint. Evidence is supposed to produce linkages, but some facts behave like mirrors. They only send you back into yourself. The building's cameras, old but not useless, showed a stranger slipping in through the basement door on afternoons when the hallways go vaguely echoey, the acoustics of people elsewhere. They'd reviewed security footage from my building and discovered he'd been inside multiple times. He'd been in my building, walking the halls, possibly even trying door handles. I imagined that hand, ordinary, clean, perhaps ink-stained from the note, perhaps not, testing the cheap hardware that pretends to promise privacy. I moved through my apartment as if each object were a witness I needed to debrief. Here is where I stand when I drink water. Here is where I leave my shoes. Here is where I don't look at myself in the mirror anymore because I don't want to see if my face has been learning his shape. The violation wasn't just about privacy anymore. It was about the complete destruction of any sense of safety. The sentence belonged to the detective, but it was also mine. It gave me back the part of my fear that had been ashamed of being fear. I told my sister I would stay with her for a while, and sleep stretched itself into a thing that sometimes remembered how to happen. But even in a different space, the window kept finding me. Glass is a promise and a dare. I stood very still in her kitchen one night and realized I was practicing becoming a different kind of stillness than his, the kind that uses quiet to survive. A thought followed like a second footstep. He does not need to be here to be present. Attention leaves residue. Once it clung to me, I had to learn how to move with it as if it were weather. When the arrest came, it wasn't his. Another man, a stranger to my stranger, had been slipping into units. A petty burglar whose bravado shrank under white light in a small room. He told the detectives about someone on the fire escapes, taking pictures of the building as if he were making a list. The idea that I might have been an item among many sent my chest hollow and echoing. They never caught him. Maybe the burglar's story scared him away. Maybe he had simply filled his notebook and turned the page. Obsession does not end, it migrates. I wish the ending were the thud of a cell door and a paper trail, threaded with my name as protected. I wish endings obeyed the same rules as grammar. Instead, I moved to a different apartment, one with no fire escapes and a clear view in all directions. I can sweep the horizon now. The roofs and the slices of sky between water towers and the distant windows that light like quiet lanterns as evening edits the day. I still check. I still adjust. My routines have become honest about being rituals. My desk sits where it must, to let my eyes cross the same small stretch of air that was once a threat and is now a test I keep passing. And yet the body keeps score. That kind of fear doesn't just disappear when the immediate threat is gone. It rewires how you see the world, how you move through spaces, how you trust your own sense of safety. I keep the detective's card in a drawer. I keep the cameras, too, though sometimes I drape them like modesty on a statue. The scariest part wasn't the stalking itself, but realizing how easily someone can slip into your life. What terrifies me now is how the ordinary becomes the corridor where a stranger can practice devotion. I lock the door, and then I lock it again. I water a plant that leans toward the window and turn it so it will lean back. I teach my own gaze new manners. How to look and not invite. How to watch without becoming a watcher. There are nights when a shape on a distant roof suggests a person thinking of leaping or looking or leaving, and I let the idea go. Not every stillness is a message, but the ones that are, those I will meet with a steadiness I had to build from scratch. Story number 2. I didn't meet the car the way you meet a person. I learned its posture first, the way it angled toward me like a question that already knew my answer. Some vehicles belong to commuters. This one belonged to the building, a chrome eyelid that never blinked. Parked where sightlines sharpened. Kept telling myself it was nothing, until the routes I walked felt scripted, and I couldn't remember when I stopped writing the script. The first time I saw the driver, I understood he hadn't been chasing. He'd been curating, as if my days were an exhibit to be tended. By the time the badge and the file arrived, I'd already learned what it feels like to be a map someone else is holding. I work in a mid-sized tech company. The kind that builds optimism into its slogans and keeps fear outside with bright paint and glass. My desk sits in a room where acronyms hum and calendars multiply, where I am paid to summon attention from strangers. Job title, marketing coordinator. Real title, a person who narrates patterns until they look like decisions. Outside. Concrete ribs hold up our offices. A layered hive with numbered aisles. Arrows telling you how to behave. People consider a parking garage a place for transitions. A grey pause between somewhere and somewhere else. I learned it's also a perfect auditorium. The acoustics of vigilance are different there. Tires murmur on ramps, lights do not dim so much as admit they're tired. Columns cut corridors into frames. And in every frame you can be seen without seeing back. The first day I noticed the sedan, I couldn't even have told you why. Maybe the shade on its hood matched the sky. Maybe the angle of its mirror looked like a cupped palm. I told myself I recognized the model because I once rented one on a trip that wasn't worth the photos. I told myself, and then I kept telling myself, until telling myself became a routine. The sedan preferred corners with options, places where a driver could coast without blocking, where departure had the privacy of a thought. I kept encountering it in different levels, tucked in shadow, then basking under the ceiling glare. Not once did I hear a door open. Not once did I pass a body standing beside it, rummaging for a badge, balancing a laptop bag. There were other cars, of course, dust-laced SUVs, tiny hatchbacks with stubborn stickers, practical 4 doors that carried yogurt and meetings. Those cars were verbs. This one was an I. I grew curious the way you grow cold, slowly, then completely. I tried to rationalize it as overflow, as a commuter sharing a pool nearby, as a neighbor avoiding tickets, but the placements kept forming geometry around me. The nose of the sedan aimed at the mouth of an elevator one day, then at the bruised blue door of a stairwell the next, as if practicing pronunciation. I started to notice how the spaces it chose allowed unbroken lines toward my route, the turn by the painted arrows, the gap by the concrete lip that steals a wheel if you aren't careful. The corridor that seems like an escape until you count how many cameras are whispering, "No." I didn't change my habits then. I let habit observe me. Curiosity became an assignment. I collect patterns for a living. And suddenly there was a pattern with my name on it. I began testing the building, the way you test a story, move a scene, and watch what insists on staying. I changed rows. I claimed a bland spot, and then, 2 days later, a crooked one near the water stains where only daring drivers squeeze. I took a long way in, the path past the lower entrance with the mangled cone, then switched to the ramp with the gouge from a truck with bad judgment each time. The sedan learned me back. It didn't mirror me at once, which would have been crude. It drifted close, like a thought, pretending not to be an obsession. I wore different shoes, carried my jacket instead of wearing it, paused at the turn where the light flickers into a dull strobe that makes photos look haunted. The car's reappearances seemed timed to my indifference. The more I tried not to notice it, the more it made itself convenient to notice. I told a colleague once, in the careful tone of a person describing a dream. He nodded in the careful way you nod at a person who needs the conversation to end kindly when a danger is a bad elevator pitch, too long to explain, too quick to dismiss. One evening, my nerve frayed enough for record keeping. I used my phone like a field notebook and wrote about the angle of the hood, the scuff on the rear bumper, the dangling tree-shaped charm that didn't smell like anything. I took photos of where it perched relative to painted numbers. I jotted down the plate, no state nickname, just letters that fell into a forgettable rhythm. If anyone had asked, I would have said I was making a scrapbook of blandness. It felt reassuring to move my fear into columns, date, level, Second landmark. Data is a way of disguising prayer, but data, if you have enough of it, becomes evidence, and then evidence starts to speak. On the morning that turned the discipline into dread, I reached the upper level and glanced across the concrete pasture. A face watched the ramp the way fishermen watch water. He did not look like an emergency dam, he looked like an errand. Dark cap, plain jacket. Posture of someone who wants to be mistaken for idle. He sat with his hands just out of sight, then lifted a black tube whose glass mouth drank the distance between us. The moment I deviated, passing the column instead of rounding it, his posture hardened into focus. I didn't walk to my car. I walked to a different floor and stared out a window cut into the stairwell wall. And through that cheap rectangle of safety, I saw him waiting again. The sedan angled so that either exit, the door to the lift or the concrete steps, would pour me into his field of view. I had the sensation of being hurried without anyone touching me. I called downstairs. The guard who met me had shoulders like a retired athlete and a voice that belonged to a coach who had decided not to yell anymore. His name tag said Marcus. He listened like a wall that knows which side should echo. "Let's go look," he said, and we went. Though by the time we reached the level I'd described, the car had retreated into the anonymity of departures. Security cameras remember what people forget. We pulled the angles, we rolled the last hour. And there it was. A silver shell skipping frames like a cautious animal. I spotted the glossy cylinder in the driver's hands, the modular body, and long lens that turns distance into trespass. The tape, digitally stored. No actual tape, but it still feels like a tape when you rewind life, showed the sedan as a habit that predated my attention. I'd been late to my own story. When the detective arrived to the hill, she held a notepad without rushing it. She had the calm of someone who reads storms professionally. Detective Chen. The syllables fit neatly, like a door that doesn't fight the frame. She asked me to tell the whole of it, then the part I left out, then the part I hadn't realized I knew. We walked again through the footage, pausing on the angles where the sedan waited for stairs or lift. She had a way of naming things without letting the name become the whole truth. "Stalking is a method," she said. "Methods are reliable until they aren't." She asked for my routes, my habits, where I grab coffee, where I cross the street because the sun is kinder there, where I stand when I need service enough to resent it. When I told her I work with attention for a living, she nodded as if I had confessed to painting targets for sport. She asked if I'd ever seen the man outside of the ramps. I shook my head and tried to remember if any particular day had felt more watched than any other. Memory mimics loyalty even when it's nothing of the kind. She returned the next day with printouts and a patience that lets silence do some work. Footage stitched into narrative suggests competence. What it really suggests is proximity. She showed me stills of the sedan near different columns, arranged like a flip book of intent. Next to each, a screenshot, not of the car, but of me. Captured by mounted eyes we pretend are ornamental. In one frame, my hand paused on a banister. In another, my foot hovered over a painted arrow. In a third, my head angled toward a different corridor than the one I continued into. She explained how offenders try not to touch the plan too hard. That way, when you doubt, the plan still exists. And when you stop doubting, the plan is ready. She asked about nights, about mornings, about departures that look accidental. I resisted calendar words. I didn't want time to become a character. She didn't need numbers anyway. She had timestamps. A map of comings and goings proved I wasn't imagining the choreography. The sedan arrived when my schedule strained. It idled when I lingered. It adjusted when I adjusted, always with a delay polite enough to pass for coincidence. The politeness was the signal. The politeness meant rehearsal. But they pulled a license plate from the recordings that mattered, and a name unspooled, a freelancer who aimed for magazines and weddings and the kind of portraits that make ordinary faces look expensive. He lived in an apartment complex a short drive from our offices, the kind of place with units that share a courtyard of thirsty plants. When they went by, the lights were on, but the drawers were clean. Neighbors remembered a quiet man who carried cases and returned with silence. Tenants said he'd once asked management about angles, what unit looked out on which lot, where the best line of sight was if you liked to photograph birds. Even birds felt implicated. The detective didn't smile. She talked to our building and the buildings next to ours. She talked to the cafe that knows my order even when I don't. None of them said his name, but all of them recognized his shape. A week passed, the way a page turns when you already know the ending. I changed where I parked again, and I changed how I arrived. Sometimes I rode with a co-worker, sometimes I stopped on a different floor where nobody stops. The level that smells like a leak you can't find, and I tried to starve the research he was doing on me. I kept moving the hypothesis. I learned the names of more guards. I let police escorts idle nearby. Their patience, a new kind of soundtrack. I relearned the staircase so I could land soft. I carried, once, a red scarf so I could identify myself from the cameras later and remember where I had been, and so I could spot, on playback, whether he had already learned the scarf too. The detective told me that most hunters quit when the prey stops being naive. Your awareness is a wall, she said. Build it without building a prison. I wanted to be grateful, and I wanted to be furious that this was work I now did for free. Eventually, he made a mistake that wasn't a mistake so much as a culmination. He went to another lot, on another side of a city that teaches traffic to make moral decisions. He waited for another woman. Someone else noticed. Someone else named it quickly. There was a stop that became a search that became a set of photos on a hood and a pile of objects laid out like a diagram. Receipts with circles, a zoom camera, a roll of tape, gloves that were clean enough to pass inspection, and a book. A thick notebook whose patient handwriting widened my ribs with cold. The case wasn't just me, it was an archive. My name threaded through it in a dozen careful mentions. He'd charted the way I drift at crosswalks, the way I prefer to walk on the left of pillars, the way I keep my bag at my front on crowded walkways and on my shoulder when the corridor opens. Oh. There were notes about a blue jacket he liked on me, and a list of days when the office felt emptier. Tuesdays and Thursdays starred for endurance. One page held a sketch of an internal map with a triangle drawn beside the words North Stairwell. He had written, learned to wait, in the margin. There was a section labeled with a word I refused to give myself permission to own. Target. Next to it, details. Brand of my car, photo of my plate. Routes I favor when carrying plants from the market. He'd written, no pets. As if absence itself were a data point. He had given me a grade for predictability. He had practiced changing assumptions the way one practices scales. One entry ended with a sentence no one should ever read about themselves. Observation complete, comfort achieved. Another, near the end, ongoing surveillance not advised, attention has consequences. It might be the purest sentence he ever wrote. Attention had consequences. It had found him. He was arrested. He entered a system that is equal parts ledger and theatre, where words like trial preparation fold into hearings you can't believe you are attending, where file numbers follow your name into rooms you never wanted to learn the air of. When conclusions came, they were written in the arithmetic of punishment, probation and a restraining order, a span of time assigned to a promise that felt like a wire. What the conclusion didn't include was relief. Relief is not a document. Relief is a muscle that refuses to unclench. I rearranged my days. I left by routes that made no sense to anyone observing on a map. I traded convenience for the clean ache of uncertainty. I rotated between decks and lots, learned to park in places that were close to exits and far from routine. The detective said I had learned the curriculum quickly, that awareness is a course with no graduation, only better grades. There was a ceremony I attended in my head, the version of me who used to walk through the automatic doors without thinking, handing a diploma to the version who keeps choosing to look both ways, even in corridors designed for one direction. I wish I could tell you I returned to ease. I learned instead to carry competence. In the mirror, I searched for cars that matched the paint of a cloud. In Austin, sedans are a species you can't avoid. The first month after the file closed, I counted them until numbers felt like superstition. Then I started naming them. There's comfort in making a taxonomy of threats. On a soft day, I moved to a place with underground spaces and a gate that slides without arguments. I learned new codes and I made old codes obsolete. I replaced locks because replacing locks feels like replacing the past. I brought my plants. They settled in the light like nothing had ever happened. I learned the faces of new guards, and I made them laugh with a story that was only funny because it was over. One of them told me you can tell who has been through something by how they pause before pressing a button. I asked which button. He said any of them. I found that true. Some mornings I pause before starting my car. Some evenings I pause before pressing the key fob. Some nights I pause for no reason other than honoring the person I no longer am. If you looked at a time lapse of me now, you'd say nothing much happens. You'd be wrong. A person is rebuilt in the subtleties. Caution is not fear, it is respect for the fact that some people study lives as if they are locks, and some people learn to be doors that open only inward. There are parts of the story I still tell with my shoulders. There are parts I tell with my calendar, now written in pencils that erase cleanly. At work, I present creative that turns curiosity into engagement. And I know now that attention is a creature with teeth. I changed emails, shifted subscriptions, stopped broadcasting small routines for no reason other than because I can. The folks in charge of security did sessions that weren't trainings as much as acknowledgements. They walked us through routes that keep lines of sight short and help accompany one another. I learned to ask for an escort when I feel the narrative leaning in the wrong direction. The escorts idle with their engine running like a promise. And I breathe without calling it that. Sometimes I walk past the wall of screens that knows what we did today better than we do. And I catch my reflection in the glass over a split of the lot. And for half a heartbeat, I think the person in the glass is the watcher.
Then I remember I am, at last, the person who learned to watch back.
I kept a copy of one page from the notebook, not as a relic, but as a curriculum, and I redacted the name. I left the line where he wrote, "Moved on to easier observation." It's the ugliest sentence I've ever chosen to keep. It's also a reason, on that page I've added my own line. Moved on to harder living, harder meaning stronger, stronger meaning deliberate. There is no victory in this. There is only competence and a willingness to love the parts of your life you refuse to surrender to fear. When I drive into a deck now, I choose a lane I didn't use last time. I walk under a different set of lights. I pass columns and count them like blessings. Not because counting saves me, but because the counting is mine. I still glance at every elevator and every stairwell door and every silent car, angled a little too well. The glances are not prayers, they are proofs. I don't measure time anymore by what was done to me. I measure it by what I do on purpose. If you are waiting for a moral, I can offer only a practice. You do not owe strangers your habits. Your routine is a house. Keep its windows where you want them. Hang curtains that move when you decide. Invite who you like. Laugh when you can. And if a watcher has set up shop in the mirror of your day, name it. Out loud if you have to. There are professionals who will write it down and hold it with you until the end. There are friends who will learn the edges of your fear and stand there with their hands open, not to grab you, but to promise you still own your life. We are not collections of patterns to be purchased with patience. We are weather, apparent to all, predictable to none. Tomorrow, I will park somewhere I've never parked. I will take a path I didn't write in advance. I will pass a silver car that belongs to nobody I know. I will let it be a car. And I will let me be a person moving through concrete, watched by cameras that fail to tell the whole story, held by a sky that doesn't care who's counting. Story number 3. I used to go to the gym to quiet the static in my head. 1 hour of breath and rhythm, and the day's alarms faded like steam. Then the quiet learned my roots and sat down beside them.
He didn't sweat. He studied. Every lift turned into a mirror, every mirror into a sight line above, until I realized I wasn't training in a room, I was being measured in it.
When we finally pulled the footage, my reflection looked back at me from angles I never knew existed, annotated like a specimen, prepared for a lesson I hadn't agreed to attend. Names can be faked, addresses can be borrowed, but attention is a blade, weightless until you feel it slide along the places you thought were yours. I changed gyms, habits, and routes, and still there are nights I feel a seat filled just behind me, as if routine itself learned my pulse and keeps time with it. The same guy was always using the equipment right next to mine, that thin, ignorable thread that frays into a noose if you keep tugging. At first I told myself I was inventing patterns. The floor plan made strangers look like neighbors, and mirrors could stack chance until it resembled intent. But the intent kept showing up in my peripheral vision. If I reached for the rower, he drifted to the treadmill that offered a direct view of whatever I was doing. If I faced the glass for a fast, brutal climb, he posted up where he could watch my reflection. Head slightly tilted as if he were reading a chart with my body on it instead of my name. Everyone else in Fit's zone looked like they always had. Driven, distracted, amused, human. He looked like a placeholder for a role he hadn't earned. He'd settle in, thumbs living on his phone, eyes returning to me every few breaths. It felt less like a workout and more like a rehearsal, marks taped invisibly to the rubber floor, cues only he could hear. He was performing some kind of elaborate theatre, and I was the set dressing he needed to make it believable. I'm a nurse. I build my day out of triage and ritual, in a job where alarms are constant. The gym became the place my body remembered it belonged to me. The gym was my sanctuary, not sacred exactly, but fair. Effort went in, effort came out. That's why the theatre broke something in me I didn't know could break. I started testing without admitting I was testing. I changed entry doors and crossed the floor at odd diagonals. I moved from cardio to free weights against my own routine. I swapped the order that kept my knees calm and my back honest. He drifted with me like a tide that preferred a single shore. Part of me tried mercy. Maybe he was recovering from injury and the almost workout was his slow return. Maybe he was lonely and thought proximity might grow into courage. Then the numbers started to whisper. He appeared when I appeared, and not a moment sooner. He left only when I left. If I paused to stretch, he paused to study. He counted only when I counted. Reps of nothing, rhythm without purpose. He never seemed to actually work out. So I went where I thought a man like him couldn't. I stepped into the women's only section, that small harbour, with quieter talk and slower exhale, where bodies could be bodies without being surveyed. Through the glass, I watched the main floor the way a diver watches the surface. And there he was, orbiting. When angles failed him, he found the water station just beyond the glass and held a paper cup like a pass. He didn't drink. He stared. 20 minutes of pretending to hydrate while keeping me inside his line of sight. It wasn't random equipment selection, it was choreography written in my breathing. I went home with my hands still smelling faintly of sanitizer and steel. In the car, I didn't turn the music on. I watched the lot for a while, not sure what I expected to see. not sure if I wanted to see it. My chest hurt the way it does when a long shift turns into a longer one. I had spent the day keeping people safe from pain I could measure. I didn't know how to measure this. I told Maya because Maya knows the heartbeat of the building. She can land a crowd without raising her voice. She can talk a teenager through a first lift or close a stranger's tab with a look. I didn't want to be dramatic. I wanted to be wrong. She listened like a metronome listens, steady, no judgment, then beckoned me behind the desk. Keystrokes, camera feeds, check-in logs, the quiet glow of a system that sees you even when no one does. My name marched down the screen like steps on a treadmill. Beside it, another name had started marching in time. "Let's see outside," she said, and we stepped into the dim meadow of the parking lot monitors. White light made long shadows. Cars glowed. Asphalt breathed heat back to nobody. There he was, idling under a lamp, letting minutes comb past before sliding out of his seat and following behind me with lazy precision. The parking lot cameras blinked indifferently, but my body read them like eyes. "This is stalking," Maya said. "Not big, not performative, just true. We should ban him from the premises and call the police. Membership records gave us a puppet made of paper, fake phone number, address that didn't exist, a card registered to a different name. The profile was a body without a pulse. I can stabilize a failing airway and count compressions by instinct. But this was a different kind of emergency. It made the room feel taller and my reach feel shorter. The officers came with the kind of calm that keeps people from breaking themselves on their own fear. The detective who led them introduced herself, Detective Rodriguez, and said my name as if she were fitting it into a sentence that had been waiting for it. She wanted the choreography, not the machines, the order, not the weights. I told her how he arranged himself like a mirror that kept replacing the others. She wrote, asked again, wrote some more. Then she ran the plate we had on the screen. The name that came back was solid. The kind that has a lease and a mailbox. Trevor Walsh. At Trevor's place, a roommate answered the door. There's something surreal about a person's name becoming a hallway you might have walked past 100 times without looking. Something worse about learning that this hallway has your name written somewhere inside it. The roommate said Trevor had questions about when I usually showed up, what shifts a nurse might work, which days the gym posted class photos. He said the wall in Trevor's room looked like a project, and not the good kind. The detective nodded the way people nod when they've seen a story enough times to know the ending isn't an accident. We printed stills from the lot and clips from the floor while I wrote a statement, hands steady out of habit. The strange thing about fear is how ordinary your handwriting looks while it's happening. The wall they showed me later wasn't covered in darkness, it was covered in detail. Flyers printed from the gym's page, group shots after classes, promos for member milestones. Every single photo that included me had been circled with red marker, little notes underneath in careful print, color of my shoes, which rack I used, who I laughed with. He was using the gym's social media presence the way a sailor uses weather, reading currents, predicting tides, waiting for favorable winds. And it wasn't only me, like 4 other circles, like 4 other sets of notes. Truth wasn't cinematic, it was procedural. People who hoard tiny facts become heavy enough to bend other people's days. The camera near my apartment confirmed what exhaustion hid from me. He followed me home from the gym. My neighbor's system caught him sitting in his car outside my apartment building. Engine quiet, posture forward, attention drawn tight. The detective's mouth settled into a line that meant she could see the next page and didn't want to read it. Public spaces offer cover, she said, but escalation lives in the gaps, places with fewer witnesses and security cameras. They arrested him before collection turned into an attempt. In the end, he pleaded guilty to stalking charges for multiple victims, and sentencing read like math, but the numbers felt like breath. 18 months in prison plus 3 years probation. Paperwork unfolded, restraining orders, notifications was phone calls that use your name in ways that make your body want to sit down. The gym answered with policy instead of apology, stricter verification of membership information, staff training that put a backbone under the word safety, and a new rulebook for what the community posted and when. There was a meeting for the women he had tracked, and we didn't trade horror stories so much as logistics, where to park, how to ask for a walkout without explaining yourself, what a front desk script should sound like when someone says, "I think I'm being watched." We wrote names on index cards so our nods had something to land on. Something about saying those names aloud stapled us back to the ground. The detective called once more to say the roommate had confirmed the obvious. Trevor mapped routines because predictability made him brave. It wasn't passion, it wasn't fate, it was homework. There's power in naming a thing that small. Time didn't reset, it learned a new outline. I chose a different facility across town, a tag that didn't know my hand yet, a layout that required me to relearn where the mirrors bite. I scattered my habits so they couldn't be graphed. Different doors, varied lanes through the lot, racks that faced blank walls instead of reflective ones. I stopped writing my name on whiteboards and stayed off member spotlights. I still trained, because training was how I remembered I was more than a target. I edited the part of training that pretended solitude and safety with the same word. People say feeling of being watched like it's a mood. It isn't, it's a posture your bones learn. And I wasn't afraid of the gym, I was attentive in it. I gave myself permission to pause at thresholds and read a room like a nurse reads a monitor. Trend lines, outliers, sudden spikes. I kept the kindness of effort and added the discipline of caution. Some nights, a bench sits empty behind me, and I feel my muscles brace. And the bracing is not fear, exactly. It's memory keeping me upright. When friends ask for the worst part, I don't say the footage or the car outside my building, though both still live in me. The worst part was realizing how easily a stranger could make a map out of me. Not a story, just a calendar with lines connecting my hours, like constellations that lead to a single point. Attention looks harmless until it is organized. Then it's a plan, so I let the plan change shape. I keep the sentence in my pocket, what he got, and for how long. I remember the restraining orders, not as magic shields, but as fences with teeth. I remember the women in that meeting, each of us deciding the same thing in our own words. We will not give away the rooms that kept us whole. The community he tried to twist, the way he weaponized the gym's community atmosphere, became the net that caught him. The people he tried to turn into props became witnesses who looked back. The sanctuary he tried to colonize learned to write warnings in larger type. If there's a lesson, it isn't glamorous. It's a list I pin inside my head and practice until it becomes muscle memory. Vary routes, check lines of sight, ask for company, say names, post less, notice more. It's remembering that a safe space isn't a place without harm. It's a place where harm has fewer places to hide. I go back to mirrors and refuse to let them be his. I count reps because rhythm still belongs to me. I finish, breathe, and scan the room, not because I'm scared to leave it, but because I'm learning how to stay. But on my way out, I make a point of nodding to whoever happens to look up, and I want my face to be part of somebody's net, not somebody's map. The air beyond the doors feels ordinary again, cooler in winter, heavy in summer, always honest. The quiet that returns doesn't promise safety, it promises clarity. Tonight, that's enough. Story number 4. I bought the camera to hush the dark, but the dark only learned my name. Swore a lens would end the guessing. It ended the pretending instead. Every house on our dead-end street looked sleepy and ordinary. Mine was the only one that kept a secret calendar for the night. When the truth finally stepped into the grey halo of night vision, it didn't speak. It simply stood where my welcome mat was and timed my heartbeat. By the time I understood what the device had shown me, I had already been living with him for months, only a door and my denial between us. I work from a desk pressed under the window that faces my tiny front garden. On paper, I live the kind of life people describe as gentle. A 2-bedroom cottage with a peeling fence, a short driveway, hydrangeas that refuse to die, and neighbors who wave with mugs of tea when the neighborhood WhatsApp rippled with reports of break-ins. I purchased a Ring doorbell and convinced myself I had bought sleep. I mounted it, paired the app, tested the chime, and told my sister that technology was finally better than superstition. I expected to see delivery drivers, squirrels, mail carriers, and the parade of neighbors walking their dogs. I expected the ordinary. I did not expect the clockwork choreography of a stranger's attention. The motion alerts arrived like the weather, often ignorable, ambient. For a few days, I let them pile up while I coded and microwaved leftovers and played gentle documentaries to keep the silence from feeling like a visitor. Then I did what any anxious person does. I scrolled back through everything I had ignored. That's when the pattern clicked into place. Bright as a street lamp I'd somehow never noticed. In the same slice of night, I saw a person drift up the porch, pause before my front door, and idle there as if listening to the inside of my house. No package in hand, no phone glowing, no reason to be exactly where a stranger shouldn't linger. The image looked grainy but unwavering. Shoulders, a cap, a patience I could feel in my teeth. The first truth of fear is not volume, it's repetition. I told myself it could be a jogger who liked the hush, or a neighbor cutting across lawns because the sidewalks curve the long way. I told myself stories about tired men who choose the wrong house to tie their shoe. Then I watched one of the clips again and noticed how the figure's weight shifted toward the door. How the head tilted as if measuring something. The camera can't give you breath or smell or motive, but some intentions you can read, like handwriting, and I realized the person was mapping me, not visiting me. I called the non-emergency line and met Detective Williams on my lawn the next afternoon. She had the weary competence of someone who has outlived every kind of promise. She watched the videos, asked me to email the files, and walked the perimeter with slow, almost affectionate attention. "There's a gap in the fence," she said. "If I wanted to cut through the back, I'd pick that." The word she didn't say, wanted, hung in the air long after she left. The police could drive by. The police could advise, but the gap remained, along with the person who knew where it was. So I bought more eyes, one camera on the side path, another over the back door, a third pointed down the street to catch anyone approaching. I added motion sensors, window contacts, a modest security sign with a confident font. In the daytime, the new angles felt like power. At night, they felt like glasses you wear after you've learned too much. The first midnight with the new setup. The footage stitched a longer story for me. He parked 3 houses down. He moved along hedges like a tide, not wanting to be noticed. He used shadows like hallways. He checked the latch by the kitchen. He touched the bedroom window screen and didn't mind the spider web. He stood at the front door long enough to memorize where the wood splinters. Then he drifted back, retracing invisibility. I watched a dozen nights and learned the cadence of someone else's patience. On evenings when my office light burned later, he waited farther away. As if courtesy was part of the process. When I went out of town, I left the house dark and honest. That was the night he traded courtesy for rehearsal. The video showed his hand test the handle. Once, then again. As if comparing outcomes, he stepped to the side of the house and lingered long enough for moonlight to move on the grass. And he was not guessing anymore, you see. He was confirming. There is a line between no one is here and someone is here. There is another line between someone is here and someone has plans. I crossed both in a week. I sent the new footage to Detective Williams, who called me before breakfast and skipped the softening words. "We're elevating this," she said. "This is not a wanderer." She scheduled extra patrols, collected my files on a drive with a chain of custody like a rosary, and explained that porches are strange legal ground, that trespassing can be a story about inches and intent. She asked me to add one more camera to face the street. She asked me to keep logging everything. She asked me to lock the deadbolt even when I was home. Her voice was calm and exact, like a harness. That same week, an officer in a marked car rolled past my house at the hour I now knew too well. He wasn't part of the undercover team. He was just orbiting the neighborhood, the way light does. Almost absent-mindedly, the person who had practiced absence panicked at the presence. He broke his route, sprinted into the open, and met the patrol car's headlights like a photograph of guilt. The chase was brief enough to feel unreal. 2 blocks later, the radio crackled, my phone lit up. They had someone in cuffs. His name was Marcus Chen. Unemployed, formerly a construction worker, living across town in an apartment that had no plants and too many notebooks. And in his car, they found a ledger that didn't bother to lie. Entries for me marked with my street, tallies of when my porch light glowed, notes about which nights I worked late, careful timings of when the neighborhood quieted into trust. The words Target 4 appeared clean on the page, but 4 is the kind of number that fits in your mouth. It did not fit in my day. The search warrant for his apartment added texture I wish I didn't have. There were maps drawn like recipes, and there were lists for grocery days, mine included, with the price of avocados as if the market influenced my vulnerability. There were sketches of backyards with arrows through the dark. There were accounts of 3 other women, all robbed of the specific safety you make with lamps and schedule. The break-ins we had described to each other as random were not random. They were rehearsed entrances, polished like tools. When Detective Williams slid a photocopy of 1 page toward me for the pre-trial prep, I thought I would cry. Instead, I felt a calm I didn't trust. The notes called my lock standard deadbolt, my side window loose screen, my routine predictable. It is strange to read your life the way a thief reads it, as a set of handles. The person who wants your house doesn't want your furniture. He wants the version of you that believes doors are conclusions. The story the court accepted was simple. He had stalked. He had planned. What did? He had acted with intent. He pled guilty to stalking, attempted burglary, and trespassing. The sentence, 4 years, looked both small and immense. A bundle of time that would end while my habits continued to breathe. I received restitution for the cameras I had bought after the first camera told the truth. Friends congratulated me, as if any of us had won something. The neighborhood cheered for the police and brought muffins and spare keys. I nodded and thanked and slept in small increments, like an accountant of shadows. That was months ago. I still wake to check the network of eyes I've built, the ones that alert my phone, the ones that send a nudge to a server and a nudge to the station. I've made rituals because rituals feel like work. And work feels like control. I touch the deadbolt twice. I test the window alarms I installed after the trial. I do not apologize for the way my shoulders rise when a branch sways near the lens. In the morning, I scroll the timeline and breathe when I see only cats and mail carriers and a neighbor's teenager walking too quickly toward tomorrow. Some mornings I watch the old files again. The way people replay a miracle. Survival can look like a miracle too, if you're willing to count it that way. I used to think privacy was an inside word. Close the blinds, lower your voice, lock the door. I understand it begins outside, where people decide whether your life is a route or a boundary. The doorbell that promised reassurance delivered evidence. It announced what the night already knew. That safety is not the absence of danger, but the presence of attention. I was being studied. The house was being read. The pages were my habits, and the margins were where he practiced. He did not pick my home for its charm. He picked it for its rhythm. Sometimes I sit in my office and narrate my day to the lens, as if telling the camera makes the truth belong to me first. I say, I'm making tea, I'm calling my sister, I'm taking the trash out from the side gate, the one I repaired with 3 screws and a stubborn kind of hope. I say, I'm here, I'm not a schedule, I'm not a map, I'm not an empty hour you can underline. The camera answers with nothing, which is the only honest answer a machine can give. Still, the little ring of light by my front door glows, and the street hums with a cautious normal. The hydrangeas refuse to die. The fence needs paint. The porch boards remember footsteps and forget them again. These are the details of a place you keep by living in it. One evening, a new neighbor walked over with a jar of jam. She peered at the doorbell and said it was cute, like a tiny robot that says hello. I could have told her everything. I could have taught her about patterns and the way they masquerade as comfort until they don't. I could have told her about the word undercover, about reports and timestamps and the strange limbo of knowing something bad is likely and being told it isn't yet. Instead, I said, it helps me sleep. It was not exactly a lie. It was the kind of truth that's safe to carry into someone else's kitchen. Fear didn't move out when he did. It pays rent in vigilance and reorganizes your furniture into sight lines. I keep the printed copy of the officer's report in a folder I could find in a fire. On the cover I wrote, in thick marker, a sentence I want to remember when the alerts feel silly or the routine feels excessive. You didn't imagine it, and you didn't invite it. My therapist says the body learns danger in a language it doesn't forget, that the shaking hands and the narrow breaths are simply fluency. She says the antidote isn't amnesia, it's choice. So I choose my rituals. I choose to learn my house again, this time as a place that can be both watched and home. And some nights, for no reason at all, I step onto the porch with a mug and the sort of calm you borrow from the sky. I look toward where he once parked. 3 houses down, a space now occupied by the new neighbor's hatchback. I count the porch lights glowing like small planets along the block. I listen to the quiet shape itself around ordinary lives, including mine. Then I go back inside, lock the deadbolt, and leave a lamp on. Not as a signal to anyone watching, but as a promise to the person I am when the recording stops. The camera didn't make me safe, it made me honest, and honesty, I've learned, is a much better alarm. Story number 5. I used to believe my posts evaporated into the scroll like steam rising off a cup. Then a stranger arranged the vapor into a map. I told myself I was careful. No live locations, small circles, delayed uploads, until the pattern I thought I owned began to move toward me. There are strangers you pass on sidewalks and strangers who live in your notifications. Only one of them knows what time you unlock your door. If you assume your feed is forgettable, you haven't met a person willing to study it like scripture. I'm telling this the way you check the locks, methodically, a hand on every hinge, because denial is the last privacy setting we turn off. What began as harmless likes and casual remarks turned into a private audit of me. Someone had stitched together my life from scraps I'd let drift online for 2 years. I'm 29, a marketing manager in Denver. The sort of person who blurs license plates in photos and never posts my exact corner. I held my phone like a mirror, not a beacon, latte art when the foam curled like a leaf. A panorama from a ridge I loved, the warm hush of a cafe window. Friends saw them. Friends of friends asked for a trail or a roast. And I answered because sharing a view or a coffee felt like sharing water on a hot day. At first, his messages matched the tone of the platform itself. Weightless, cheerful, disposable. He liked my sunset over the foothills, said, "Great angle," then asked, "Which side trail leads to the overlook?" He said he was new to hiking but serious about it. And I believed him because seriousness online looks a lot like enthusiasm. He knew I hiked most Saturday mornings and that I usually went alone. He wondered if our paths had crossed. He said he noticed patterns as if he were complimenting my consistency. Patterns. The word landed like a key turning in a door I hadn't meant to lock. In my head, I kept repeating the old rules. Upload later. Never tag the exact trailhead. Check your settings until they sounded like superstition. I tried to starve the thought, but curiosity is a kind of hunger too, and his next questions fed it. He mentioned a boulder loop I'd posted once in winter and once in spring, then joked about knowing the time parking is easiest. If it had stopped there, I might have laughed it off and given him a packing list. It didn't. He began threading details into a shape I no longer recognized as coincidence. I decided to audit myself before I answered him again. He noticed more. He knew which Saturdays I tended to go, how often I hiked solo, and which canyons I favored when wind pushed hard along the divide. I waited to post until I was home. I geotagged vaguely. Still, each time he reached out, there was a new stitch in the pattern. I told myself, it's just observation. I told myself, everyone sees the same feed. Then he stepped beyond what I had said out loud. He mentioned my job at a specific marketing firm, knew I had a younger sister who lived in California, and even referenced a minor car accident I'd been in 3 months earlier. I stared at that line the way you stare at a door you're sure you locked. The accident was a paint scrape in a grocery lot. A police report that never made it past a clipboard. I hadn't posted about it. A friend made a joke about surprise adult expenses with a repair shop background. I left a single emoji. My sister posted tacos the week I flew west. Tagged me in a beach photo. I saw, suddenly, the little lint I had dropped across months, innocent, disconnected, impossible to sweep back up. I scrolled through my own past and felt my posts turn to evidence. Over 2 years of posts, stories, comments, and tagged photos had created a detailed portrait of my life that was far more revealing than I'd ever intended. Beneath it, fine print I'd never read. The background of your life contains data too. Street signs mirrored in glass, uniforms behind a counter. The third-floor brickwork of a building I only meant to show as color. A check-in at my gym combined with workout selfies revealed my exercise schedule. A co-worker once quipped in my comments that Sarah always stays late on Thursdays. And suddenly, my office quiet became a weekly appointment anyone could predict. Each harmless moment was a knot in a net I hadn't realized I was weaving around myself, and it's not illegal to be observant, I told myself. Even as my routines began to feel like habits laid on tracing paper, I began taking inventory in a notebook. Places, times, recurring faces, the shadows behind me, and I cropped my future differently. But history had already set. When his next message arrived, it was almost casual in its precision. He referenced a mural 2 doors down from me, a fox with a key in its teeth that shows up only if you know where to look. He admired the light in a coffee shop and described hanging plants I hadn't captured and a chalkboard menu reflected in a pane I hadn't shown. He said he drove a blue car too and asked if mine ever had trouble starting in cold snaps. I stopped reading and felt my apartment fold in on itself, as if I could force the walls closer with the muscles in my back. The breaking point came when Jake sent me a message that included details about my apartment building and my car. He listed the make and the color, the street where I prefer to park, and the reason I avoid the garage before sunrise. The message was long enough to swallow my breath. I immediately blocked Jake on all platforms and reported his accounts, but the damage was already done. I went to the police with screenshots, timestamps, and a timeline of escalating familiarity, likes, comments, direct messages. The moment knowledge turned into proximity. The detective who took my statement had the calm of someone who has seen this kind of fire before. This type of digital stalking often escalates to physical stalking. She warned me. She didn't say it to frighten me. She said it so I would treat what I knew with the seriousness it deserved. They opened a file with my name and, carefully, They traced Jake Morrison's social media accounts and discovered they were fake profiles created specifically for stalking purposes. The pictures were stolen from a barista in Oregon, from a man with the same eyes in a different city, from a photographer 3 states away. The location data said Denver, the IP said close. The investigation took a disturbing turn when police discovered Jake had been using the same method to stalk at least 6 other women in the Denver area. The pattern was identical, the rhythm practiced. He would start with innocent engagement, gradually reveal more detailed knowledge, then begin making suggestions about meeting in person based on shared interests he'd identified through his research. 2 of his previous targets had actually met him in person before realizing something was wrong. The detective showed me a stack of printouts and kept her palm on the corner of the papers in a small act of mercy. "This is what he does," the stack said. "This is what he will keep doing until someone interrupts it." Then came the first real slip. The breakthrough in the case came when Jake made a critical mistake, trying to impress me. He described the interior of a cafe in my photo with details that weren't in the frame. Either he'd been there when I was, or he had been watching. The detective set a quiet stakeout at the cafe. They found him at a corner table, laptop open, jumping between feeds, taking notes like a student studying a subject no one had consented to teach. When officers took him in, he was still scrolling. When officers finally put cuffs on the man behind the alias, they opened his bag to find folders on dozens of women, printouts of posts, sketched maps of the places we'd mentioned, and timetables of our days assembled from the web. In the interviews that followed, he didn't say much that mattered, and I learned his last name wasn't the one he'd used. I learned I wasn't the first file or the last, just one he had started annotating with more confidence, in a courtroom with bad acoustics. I watched him try not to look like he was looking for me. Jake pleaded guilty to multiple counts of stalking and harassment and received 2 years in prison plus 5 years probation with restrictions on his internet usage. It sounds tidy written like that. Heavy and light at the same time. Sentences end. What doesn't end is the habit of looking over your shoulder and seeing your past in the corner of your eye like a reflection on glass. It's been 14 months since Jake's arrest, but I've completely changed how I interact with social media. I keep my circles small. I've made all my accounts private, stopped posting location-based content, and regularly audit my friend lists to remove people I don't know personally. I post less and plan more. When I share, I let hours pass, sometimes days, sometimes not at all, and I talk to my sister on the phone instead of in comments. I text a photo to a friend rather than a feed. I don't geotag, I don't pan across my street to capture the color of a sky that can be recognized by someone who knows the skyline. I still love the mountains, and I still love the feeling of telling a story and having someone nod along. I just understand the difference between audience and access. Here is the lesson I didn't know I was teaching the whole time I was posting it. The scariest part wasn't that someone was following me online, it was discovering that years of normal social media activity had created a detailed blueprint of my life that could be used by anyone with enough patience and dedication to piece together. He had converted my footprint into an instrument of monitoring, mining my feed and my network's chatter to compose a dossier, habits, bonds, soft spots, things I never meant to hand to a stranger. When I step outside now, I breathe a little deeper and look up before I look down at my phone. I still exist online, just less as a map and more as a voice. Story number 6. He told me there was something under my car, and it wasn't a part. Beneath the bumper, a magnet smaller than a matchbox owned the map of my life. Whoever planted it didn't want to scare me. They wanted to know me. I used to think routine meant safety. That day I learned routine is a doorway. By the time I saw the device, it already knew everywhere I'd ever go. I was driving, a life you could set your watch to, home, clinic, grocery, my parents' place, when a stranger quietly edited the syllabus at the shop I trusted. The owner wiped his hands and asked if I could step to the back bay. He lifted my car, pointed, and something inside me tilted. There, fitted into a pocket of shadow near the rear frame, was a small black device, no bigger than an idea you don't want to face, attached to the underside of my car as if it had a title to the metal. He said he'd found it while tracing a rattle that had no business being there. It wasn't noisy, it was worse than noise. It was quiet, with purpose. The object was unnervingly modest, a matte shell, unbranded, edges softened by intention rather than wear. He set it on the service cart and it looked like a harmless pill case until you considered what medicine it dispensed. The truth embarrassed me with its simplicity. I had been tracking my every movement without knowing, because someone else had wrapped my errands for an audience. They had turned my car into a mobile surveillance device made to broadcast my location to a screen I'd never see. A live weather report of my habits. It wasn't even dramatic. It was tidy and sure of itself. He told me to sit, poured water, and dialed, introducing himself as Tony Martinez from Martinez Auto Repair. While he spoke to the dispatcher, he said, "This isn't from Toyota." And the sentence cut a clean line through the room. On the cart sat a small black rectangular device, sealed tight. Magnetically attached, when he slid it free from a seam that looked like it had always been there. In my hands, it felt heavier than physics. He guessed it was a GPS tracker and that, given the grime pattern, it had been sending your location in real time long enough to mistake my life for a schedule. The detective who arrived didn't carry panic. She carried order. Detective Rodriguez studied the thing the way a cartographer studies a coastline, measuring the cost of every curve. She didn't sweeten anything. Whoever planted it, she said, had studied me closely, not as a curiosity but as a project. The hardware was quick and quiet. The software would be quicker and quieter. A subscription could turn my daily drives into lines across a city and call them habits. Habits are doors that never bother to lock. She explained how professional kits combine glass calm antennas with modest boxes. To the careless eye, they look forgettable, which is why they're so hard to question. What unsettled me most wasn't the circuitry, it was the intimacy of the installation. This wasn't a coin tossed into the well of a wheel. It took nerve and time under my car. It took choosing a secure mounting point when my car was parked at home or in the lot behind the clinic or along a curb where streetlights were tired. It took certainty that no one would lean down to look. I had been easy to reach because my life was easy to predict. The detective sealed the device like a tiny meteor and logged it with the steady posture of someone who refuses to share power with a box. She walked me through what would come next. This was professional-grade equipment, not a novelty purchase. It likely paired cellular connectivity with long battery life, the sort used by private investigators or law enforcement, and by those who pretend to be either. It would have a web dashboard, something dull and efficient, offering clear satellite reception and the comfort of dashboards, dots, arrows, timestamps, rules. The ecosystem for obsession wears a work uniform. I drove home without the weight of the magnet, but felt heavier anyway. Every stoplight converted into a question. Who knew this corner? Who memorized this turn? I took the elevator and watched my reflection change its mind 3 times. In my living room, I stood still long enough to notice how quiet I'd let my life become. Quiet is not the same as safe. It's just easier to ignore. The next call came soft and deliberate. They had pulled the device apart and found an account tag, the kind that whispers to a monitoring service when asked nicely, a subscription, a login, a billing method. My days reduced to a billable event. The detective said the system allowed a user to set alerts for when I arrived at or left places that mattered, and delivered that information through a smartphone app or website polished to look like productivity. Productivity for whom? The screen never has to ask. Back in my apartment, I went room to room like a careful guest. The windows were suddenly quizzes I hadn't studied for. Every surface had the shine of observation. I tried to reconstruct the week from memory: coffee steam, clinic hallways, the friction of a name badge on scrubs, grocery aisles that always put the bread too far left. I realized I had been narrating my life to an engine that never spoke back. The police department's tech unit reached deeper and came up with a credit card used to start the account. The name led to a door. The door led to a desk that had never learned humility. The man behind it was the kind whose shirt always looks freshly ironed, even when it isn't. His resume called him an IT specialist for a company that installed security systems. Security as a day job, intrusion as a hobby. The irony of it felt unoriginal and still managed to make my stomach tighten. A warrant turned the key that day. Inside the apartment, the temperature of the case changed. They found folders with tabs bearing first names and colors. There were binders for multiple women, my own file thick with printed maps of my daily routes, logs of arrivals and departures, underlined notes about parking spots I preferred. He had built comprehensive profiles from dots on a map until the dots learned to speak. I recognized the grocery parking lane where I always backed in too carefully. I recognized the block behind the rehab center where shade came easy in the afternoon. It is dizzying to see your life taught to someone else. There were spreadsheets to turn movement into opportunity windows, comments lifted from social media, and pages describing physical observation, the kind that doesn't need a lens because proximity is its own camera. The data showed how he matched footsteps to pings. He stood near me at the produce aisle. He lingered at the gas station while numbers scrolled on screens. He parked in the parking lot at my work and practiced being nobody. The device had not been content with listening. It had been a conductor. In a conference room that smelled faintly of paper and decisions, the detective arranged photos and inventory sheets into a narrative current. The artifacts looked unremarkable: legal pads, USB drives, routers repeating themselves. A tidy row of those matte trackers like little teeth. They had taken a workbench built for quiet wrongdoing, the kind where a soldering iron leaves a constellation of burns, cables sleeping in obedient circles. On a whiteboard, arrows, first names, neighborhoods, dates were scrubbed off to spare me. I felt both seen and erased. He wanted rehearsal to turn into ownership. That sentence found me and did not leave. His boss had trusted him with door codes and blueprints. He had converted those privileges into shortcuts. The officers said he looked unremarkable in conversation, on time, reliable. The sort of person nobody clocks twice because attention is a currency, and he paid in exact change. When they asked him questions, he offered bland answers, like a man reading the weather. The ceiling dropped lower when they opened a box mightily labeled miscellaneous. Inside was a kit of violations, thumb drives, micro lenses, ducted pieces like small intentions. Another file showed that he had used a tracker on a different woman to break into her apartment, wedging in and out between daylight and neighbors who mined their own lives beautifully. He had planted hidden cameras and taken objects that only mattered because they didn't belong to him. The case, which had already been a story with weight, learned how to cast a longer shadow, and he was booked without theatrics. In the paperwork that followed, the verbs shrank to fit the lines. He agreed to plead guilty to stalking, burglary, identity theft, and illegal surveillance. The judge worked, steady as a metronome, through language designed to be precise and unkind. He was ordered to pay restitution to the women whose doors he had taught himself to open. To the women who had to purchase their sense of safety twice, there are penalties that look clean on paper and still spill everywhere. When it ended, there was no release valve, just the strange quiet of a building after everyone goes home. People talk about closure the way they talk about weather. Hopeful, unreliable. I stood in each room of my apartment and renamed the corners. I opened a notebook and sketched my floor plan the way an architect might, not to redecorate, but to relearn ownership. A hallway is just a hallway until someone tries to name it for you, and after that, every step wants a witness. I rebuilt my days like a cautious engineer, and I moved to a place with covered parking, installed a comprehensive security system, and taught my commute to improvise. I would vary my routes not out of panic, but practice. I'd park in different locations because options are a kind of muscle, and mine needed tone. Friends called my adjustments extreme. I called them proportionate. Hypervigilance is often framed as a flaw. It's really a tool with a difficult personality. Even now, if a sedan lingers in the mirror longer than my mood allows, I outline options and choose exits that feel like decisions, not flights. My phone leaks less. My laptop speaks for itself. I treat documents like dignitaries and logs like diaries. The detective checked in once more, confirming what we all already knew. The tracker on my car had been chosen by someone conversant in trespass. She used the phrase professional-grade equipment and technical expertise, and I wrote it down because naming can sometimes trap a thing in a smaller box. There is a version of me that still believes routine is a pillar. I let her live here because she did nothing wrong. But I also leave a light on for the version who knows pillars can be hollow. When I drive now, I picture a current of data that never got to become a river. The GPS tracker is a photograph in an evidence locker instead of a secret under my bumper. The man who pinned my life to a screen can't access my hours. And still, vigilance remains, not because I expect harm, but because I understand how ordinary a doorway can look when someone decides it's theirs. I keep appointments with myself. I practice arriving without broadcasting. I try to take back what the little magnet tried to license: unpredictability. The small right to vanish for an hour into the private geography of a mundane errand. I am learning again that quiet can be chosen rather than imposed. When I return to the clinic, I move through the hall with the same steady voice I use on patients relearning their gait. I tell them balance isn't always about not falling, and sometimes it's about carrying weight on purpose. There are days I catch myself scanning bumpers in parking lots, respecting metal in a new way. I don't hate machines for what was built into mine. Tools are neutral until someone teaches them allegiance. What scares me isn't that a stranger mapped my city for me. It's how easily the map fit. The world loves a straight line. I am learning to be less convenient. And when my mechanic lifts the car now, we both look up for a second longer than necessary. We say little. We listen to the stillness honestly. It's not silence I want. It's discretion. The kind you earn by refusing to be predictable. The kind that asks no one else for permission. Story number 7. I used to think insomnia was just an argument between my body and the dark. That night I learned the dark can argue back. Someone stepped into the part of my life I never show anyone, the unguarded, unmade space where I trusted locks more than luck. I did not move. I watched the room hold its breath while my name hovered like a match you don't dare strike. Homes are supposed to remember our laughter and our work. Mine had learned a stranger's cadence instead. If fear is a teacher, mine arrived already knowing the answers and started taking attendance with my name. I am a graphic designer who lives alone in a converted loft that once stored other people's secrets. My work sinks me into odd waking stretches and long runs of quiet. But the quiet had started to feel arranged, like a stage just before the first line. But when I saw the silhouette of a stranger moving through my apartment while I lay frozen in my bedroom, I realized that months of feeling watched had escalated into the nightmare scenario I'd been unconsciously preparing for. The person who had been studying my life from a distance had finally decided it was time for a face-to-face meeting. I had spent weeks convincing myself the feeling would pass if I tightened routines. Shoes always under the bench, mail stacked with the edges aligned, the deadbolt checked with a tug. I'd been waking up at random hours feeling like something was wrong, checking locks and windows before convincing myself I was being paranoid. I told myself it was just a season, just pressure, just the ordinary static of being alive. That night, My insomnia probably saved my life because I was awake when my stalker finally made his move. The street lamp poured a pale geometry across my wall. From my bed, I had a limited view of the main living space, but I could see shadows moving across the wall from the street light outside. What I saw made my blood freeze. The shadow of a person moving slowly and deliberately through my apartment. I'd never realized how legible a life is when someone reads it with intent. Every mark I'd left on my home, the coffee ring on the side table, the slant of books, mock-ups pinned to cork, turned into labels for a stranger's study. He didn't fumble. He didn't drift. He moved like he'd been there enough times to cut out the pauses between decisions. Drawers whispered against their tracks, papers shifted. And the air changed in the way air does when it has to make room for an uninvited body. I felt the bed's weight hold me the way a seatbelt holds a passenger who wants to run. The bottom of the partition between my sleeping nook and the living area leaves a two-finger strip of darkness that becomes a window when you are afraid. Shoes paused in that thin aperture and stayed, heels parallel, toes tilted the way people stand when they listen. The silence was so complete. I was afraid they could hear my heartbeat. He didn't knock or announce himself. He let stillness do the work. Then he said my name in a practiced, almost intimate tone, like a person who has rehearsed closeness in an empty room. The familiarity in their voice, the way they said my name, like they knew me personally, made it clear this was someone who had been planning this encounter. They weren't there to steal my belongings, they were there for me. I held my breath until my lungs argued. I counted to anything that wasn't a number. He left the way he came, without drama, as if stepping out of a picture. The door became a door again. A few breaths later, the world poured back in. Questions, uniforms, careful hands. The peculiar relief of other people looking where I had been afraid to look. When the officers searched my apartment, they found evidence that made my situation much more serious than a simple break-in. My living room was a map of me. My personal documents had been carefully examined and photographed. My laptop had been accessed. It was still warm and showed recent activity. In the frame of a print over my desk, an eye had been quietly installed, a compact camera with its lens angled toward my bed. Most disturbing, they'd left behind a small digital camera hidden behind a picture frame positioned to record my bedroom area. This wasn't just an invasion, it was an installation of permanent surveillance equipment. I sat with Detective Kim at the edge of my own couch the way patients sit on the edge of an exam table. She moved with a measured certainty that starves panic of oxygen. She explained the shape of what had happened, the way professionals talk when they already understand the pattern, and you're only now learning the vocabulary. The investigation revealed that my intruder had been inside my apartment before. The lock showed signs of previous manipulation, and they'd clearly spent time learning the layout and identifying the best hiding spots for surveillance equipment. The camera's memory showed a stranger moving through my space like a landlord of the air, reading my shelves, settling onto my couch, touching what I touch. He sat, he studied, he lay on my bed like someone auditioning for a life that wasn't his. I offered details because that's what you do when your safety depends on accuracy, where I kept the spare batteries, which windows were sticky, how the door can close without a sound if you steady the knob first. The footage showed them moving through my space with complete confidence, examining my belongings and even sitting on my couch for extended periods like they owned the place. They'd been treating my home like their own private space, coming and going as they pleased. While I remained completely unaware, the detectives gathered fragments, smudges on metal, a casing print, the camera's serial number, and built a person out of them. Detective Kim traced the camera's serial number and discovered it had been purchased with a credit card belonging to Marcus Webb, a 29-year-old maintenance worker for my building's management company. His access to master keys explained how he'd been entering my apartment without forced entry, and his work schedule gave him detailed knowledge of when tenants were typically home or away, and it is an awful relief when fear becomes someone with a name. Terror shrinks by the inch as it gains an address. They knocked on his door and opened a storage unit of other people's lives. When they arrested Marcus at his apartment, they found evidence that made my case part of a much larger criminal operation. Binders labeled in a hand that tried to look tidy, property maps with dots where women sleep, the same brand of camera, spare memory cards, the peel-off backs of adhesive mounts. He'd been using his maintenance access to stalk multiple female tenants in buildings managed by his company. My apartment contained detailed files on at least 12 different women, including floor plans of their apartments, copies of their lease applications, and schedules he'd developed by observing their routines. The most disturbing evidence was a collection of personal items he'd stolen from various apartments during his unauthorized visits. He had jewelry, clothing, photographs, and even prescription medications belonging to his targets. You can prepare for a thief. It is harder to prepare for a curator. He had drafted a plan for me the way you draft a project. Headings, bullet points, contingencies. Marcus had been planning something much more serious for the night I caught him. They found detailed notes about my sleep schedule, my work routine, and even my family's visiting patterns. The camera installation had been his way of confirming the best time to make his move. I read those notes and recognized pieces of myself presented like a case study. My own habits testified against me. In the pages I could hear the voice of someone who had mistaken access for permission and proximity for belonging. The charges multiplied the way panic does when you let it rehearse. There were names besides mine now, addresses besides mine, and every one of them deserved a room that kept faith. He pled. And the court stamped a border around his life that he had crossed too easily into ours. I didn't attend the hearing. Detective Kim called afterward and told me the consequence matched the harm as well as the law could manage. She said, stopping him now had spared injuries the evidence already foreshadowed. I cried without sound. Not because tears were the right response, but because the body keeps its own accounting. I moved out of that apartment immediately and now live in a building with enhanced security and no maintenance staff access to individual units. The new place is not prettier, but it is better at saying no. I still wake up at random hours checking locks and windows, and I have security cameras throughout my new apartment that alert me to any movement. The feeling of safety in my own home never fully returned. The scariest part wasn't that someone broke into my apartment. It was discovering that my home had been violated repeatedly over months, that someone with legitimate access had been treating my private space as their personal playground, while I remained completely unaware that my most intimate moments were being observed and my personal belongings were being examined by someone who saw me not as a person, but as a target to be studied, monitored, and eventually confronted when they felt ready to escalate their obsession to a face-to-face encounter. Between then and now, I have learned a new kind of design, arranging a life so it becomes difficult to enter without permission. When I changed habits, not because fear should be the centerpiece of a room, but because respect for risk is a form of intelligence. I speak to neighbors I once passed with polite nods. We trade the details that turn a hallway into a village. My phone reminds me to review camera logs, to update passcodes, to test alarms. Doors are rituals now, windows are agreements. I leave fewer clues about departure and return. I put less of myself in places that haven't earned me. I tell the story to people who might recognize themselves in it and choose prevention over hope. There are portions of the night I refuse to name. I won't give them numbers. And I don't mark them with clocks. When a car eases under my window, I call it street. When metal touches metal, I call it building. I refuse to let fear speak in sound effects, in the counterfeit vocabulary of drama. Yet I keep telling this story, not to relive it, but to shelve it where other women, other tenants, other people with doors might reach it first. If you have ever felt watched, consider that the feeling is data, not drama. And if you've ever felt a boundary slip and thought you were imagining it, put the thought down and write a plan. Locks matter. Cameras help. Neighbors help more. Document what you doubt and tell someone you trust, because secrecy is the only climate where this kind of obsession thrives. On good nights, the loft becomes a studio again. I lay out colors and typefaces and give myself briefs that have nothing to do with defense. The old fear still tries to audit me now and then, but it finds fewer receipts. I am not cured of vigilance. I am fluent in it. It no longer devours my hours. It walks the perimeter while I build the center. And when the dark wants to argue, I let it speak to the locks I chose, the alarms I tested, and the neighbors who know my name on purpose. Story number 8. I did not lose the necklace. It left me, learned the route to my door, and returned with a message I could feel against my skin. I used to think a messy home hid nothing but laundry. Now I know clutter can hide a stranger's footsteps better than any mask. There is a special kind of fear that turns ordinary objects into sermons. A mug becomes a mouth. A book becomes a confession. A bracelet becomes a promise I never made. I have been told to tidy my life. I am tidying now, one breath at a time, because someone tried to organize me from the inside out. Listen closely. When the world insists you are safe, check the things that touch your pulse. Opening my mailbox to find my own jewelry inside a padded envelope with no return address was confusing enough. The envelope had the bored look of routine mail, but the padded lining felt like a glove around my throat. Inside my necklace lay coiled. The clasp shut as if it had decided something on its own. I stood with the key still warm in my fingers and tried to make a kind version of the story. Maybe a neighbor found it under the stairs. Maybe a friend had played a joke. But kindness could not explain the smell of unfamiliar soap rising from the chain, or how the pendant looked brighter than memory, polished by hands that weren't mine. In the daylight, it glimmered. And the glimmer said, "I have been elsewhere. And I learned your name while you slept." Home was a ground floor apartment that carried the perfumes of my work, fur, chlorhexidine, and the citrus cleaner we used on steel tables. I liked to believe that animals taught me about trust, about reading small signs. What they didn't teach was how to read my own habits. My dresser was a geography of delays, earrings stranded like tiny islands, ticket stubs pretending to be bookmarks, books and papers stacked in random piles as if the stacks knew where they wanted to be. It made a certain sense. Everything had its drift. Because of that drift, I forgave the small disappearances. A scarf absent for a while meant laundry got impatient. A ring missing from the dish meant I wore it to bed and surrendered it to a pillowcase. My life confused laziness with safety. It did so gently, and I let it. I rolled the necklace in my palm, searching the past for a click of memory, and found nothing. The absence felt like standing in a doorway and realizing the doormat says another family's name. The envelope had carried this thing back like a parcel from my own ghost. That should have been warning enough, but warnings in real life seldom present themselves as sirens. They arrive as chores. Pay attention. Look twice. Lock what you assumed could stay open. The second return taught me how to listen. A small box appeared on a Wednesday, wrapped with the care people save for gifts. Inside was a silver bracelet I'd inherited from my grandmother. I had blamed the move for losing it. I had blamed myself for not caring enough to search properly. The bracelet came home shining as though it had been taught to gleam. And there was a small additional charm attached, a tiny silver heart that belonged to no one in my family. I held the bracelet and felt a prickle of someone else's pride. It was not the pride of a thief, it was the pride of a curator. A week later, an envelope delivered a paperback, A book of poetry I kept on my nightstand had gone on a field trip and returned with annotations. The pages had been bookmarked with small pieces of paper. Certain lines about devotion carried soft grey, highlighted in pencil as if a stranger were whispering through the margins. The paper smelled faintly of skin that did not belong to me. Devotion, the book announced, could be learned by watching me sleep. I began to inventory my life. It started clumsily, phone photos of shelves, notes scribbled on scrap paper, tiny pencil dots hiding along the edges of drawers. What I discovered was a tide chart. Things were vanishing and returning on a schedule I hadn't written. A scarf gone, then back freshly laundered and folded more neatly than I ever folded anything, a ceramic coffee mug missing, then nestled in my mailbox wrapped in bubble wrap, when I dropped a book and felt something stiff beneath the back cover. I sliced it open with a butter knife and found a ledger. It was a detailed list, in careful, upright handwriting. It documented every item that had been taken, when it was removed, and when it was returned. I had tiny notes scuttled in the margins, a hair tie, a pen from my nightstand, a small decorative candle, even a pair of socks from my laundry basket. The list knew the temperature of my life down to its smallest degrees. The worst ink came next to particular entries, the ones that pretended to understand me. There was a sentence beside my grandmother's bracelet. Wears this when she's sad. Smells like her perfume. Beside the poetry book, reads before sleep. Pages 47 to 52 are her favorites. Next to a sweater, wore this on our first meeting at the coffee shop. My breath turned into something I could count but not keep. I called the police. Detective Martinez arrived with a patience that filled the room like reliable weather. She said a phrase that took the roof off my understanding. This is psychological stalking. She traced the logic aloud. They're not taking your belongings for monetary value. They're taking them to feel closer to you. The fact that they're returning them suggests they want you to know what they're doing. I remember her hands, steady, precise, as if arranging evidence were a way of returning gravity to a space. We searched for doors inside the walls. The building felt ordinary until she touched the bathroom and found its secret. A window in my bathroom that didn't lock properly, though. The pane was small and high enough to escape suspicion. That's what made it perfect. I pictured a body angling through, determined enough to squeeze through, landing on the bath mat as though it were a dock. When forensics went to work in a tunnel, the results wrote a different kind of poem. They lifted residue from the refrigerator handle and from the computer keyboard, from a light switch in the hallway, and worst of all, from my pillow. Every print read like a time card. I had not been living alone. Nights learned a new grammar. Sleep became truce. I placed hair across drawer seams and smiled without humor at my own inventiveness. Sometimes my traps told me the truth. Sometimes they told me only that fear can feel productive. Meanwhile, my apartment was being tidied without me. Shirts I never fold were folded. A shelf I had learned to ignore was dusted in my absence. And when the coffee mug returned with a small chip that hadn't been there before, Martinez held it in a gloved hand as if it might confess. It did. In the crease of that chip, they found DNA evidence. The match hung a name over our days, Robert Chen, a 26-year-old delivery driver whose work route threaded through our building like a daily ritual. His presence had been camouflaged as politeness, the casual wave, the convenience of packages arriving on time. Warrants grew out of paperwork and sent officers to his door. What they brought back was a museum of theft and fantasy. There was a shrine, their word, not mine, where my returned belongings were displayed alongside items stolen from at least 4 other women, all arranged like museum exhibits with detailed notes about when and where each item had been acquired. My life existed there as labels: bracelet, book, candle, scent, sleep. It was classification pretending to be intimacy. They found his journal, too. In it, he had documented his belief that by borrowing and caring for our belongings, He was forming intimate relationships with his targets. He'd convinced himself that the borrowing and returning was a form of courtship. He wrote about how my bracelet had absorbed my essence, and how sleeping with my pillow had made him feel connected to my dreams. His handwriting was neat enough to make a person trust it. The neatness was the lie. Martinez looked at me without decoration. She told me the piece he had saved for last. He had plans to eventually approach me directly, to build a moment in which he would reveal the extent of his surveillance and expect me to be grateful for his care of my possessions. I pictured that scene and understood that gratitude can be a weapon if someone else decides what you owe. The case moved fast because it had to. Robert Chen pleaded guilty to multiple counts of breaking and entering, stalking, and theft. He received 5 years in prison and was required to undergo psychological evaluation and treatment. Martinez said the quiet part out loud. His arrest prevented what could have escalated to kidnapping or worse. She said worse as if the word had a basement. After the sentencing, I moved. Fresh walls help, but they do not absolve. I replaced everything he touched when I could. Some days that felt like healing. Some days it felt like chasing smoke with a net. The day I sold my dresser, I watched strangers carry it away and felt the room exhale. I bought a new kettle and treated it like a guest. I did not let it learn where I reach with my eyes closed, lock by lock. I taught my doors their purpose again. I learned the patience of cameras. The modest red dot that says I was watching. I practiced a ritual for leaving and returning, hand on knob. Breath, count, enter. The mind loves to assign blame to the person who stays, and I have stopped doing that. Disorder is not an invitation, entitlement is. What frightens me now is not that someone was stealing my belongings. It was discovering that my most personal possessions had been turned into tools for psychological manipulation. The worst part is not even the trespass, it is the lesson that someone had been using my own items to build an imaginary relationship with me. Objects meant to keep me company had been drafted into a narrative that did not ask my permission. Time went by, measured not in calendars but in calm mornings. I still check the mailbox with a little ceremony, like approaching an animal that might bite or nuzzle. Most days the slot gives nothing but coupons. Once, there was a plain card with no return address. Inside, a blank sheet. I set it on the table, like a mirror that refused to show me. I waited for it to speak. It did not. That silence felt like a clean room. People call me brave. I prefer accurate. Bravery implies a finish line. Accuracy admits maintenance. I know now that safety is not a state, but a practice. That a home is not just drywall and glass, but boundary and story. I keep the photocopy of the ledger the police provided. I read it sometimes the way you read weather patterns, hoping to learn how clouds form and where they go to die. I underline the parts where he stitched love to ownership. I write my own margin notes in a marker that bleeds through. No, this is not love. This is theft styled as devotion. I practice speaking kindly to myself. I work with animals. After all, comfort is an instrument we're taught to tune. I tell myself sentences that are both instructions and lullabies. This will take time. Your room knows you. Locks are allowed to be loud. Nothing you loved betrayed you. Someone misused your love. On a good night, I fall asleep without listening for foreign breath. On a bad one, I walk the rooms and touch the edges of things until touch feels like proof. If you're wondering why I did not notice sooner, I can offer a simple answer. Life is busy. And we allow small things to drift because they promise to come back. That is how we survive our own mess. The fact that I missed a pattern does not mean I deserved it. The fact that he noticed everything does not make him clever. It makes him practiced at disrespect. There is a difference between intimacy and inventory. I keep the necklace that started this in a small, unmarked box. on a shelf I dust on purpose. Sometimes I wear it. The metal cools my skin. And I remember the first day it returned and tried to speak. I understood that someone had been inside my home. Now I understand this too. The house I live in is also the story I insist on telling about it. He tried to collect me through objects. I declined the collection. I am not a museum. I am the person who locks the door and chooses what stays. Story number 9. My face began doing things online that I never did in my own life. People I loved were hearing from a version of me that smiled with my teeth and borrowed my history, yet carried intentions I would never hold. By the time I saw it, a life wearing my name had already shaken hands with my family, my colleagues, and the parents who trusted me with their children. It took the soundless precision of an algorithm to stack my photographs into a person, and it took a human grudge to point that person at everything I cared about. I did not lose my password. I lost my reflection. I teach teenagers for a living, which means I traffic in trust. In the classroom, trust looks like a kid raising a hand and believing I will not make a spectacle of confusion. Outside the classroom, it looks like parents placing their names on permission slips, expecting that I am the same person in the hallway, in the parking lot, and in whatever corner of the internet has my photograph on it. For years, I curated that corner carefully. My social media accounts were set to private. I posted the routine joys and nothing more. Papers stacked like little cities on my desk, a bookshelf reorganized into accidental rainbows, the dog asleep like a comma at the edge of the couch. I kept my circles small because I understood how quickly a comment can turn into a crack along the surface of a life. Then my phone lit up with worry, dressed as punctuation from my sister, asking why I had sent a plea for money and why my voicemail felt like a door everyone had given up knocking on. I opened the apps I use the way people open a front door after a storm, bracing for the waterline. Nothing. My pages were quiet. My messages were my own. Yet panic has a way of testing the floorboards of a memory. And I searched for my name, the way you search for a noise in a dark house. The search results handed me a stranger with my face. There was another profile using my name, my photos, and detailed information about my life. But it wasn't my account. It wore my graduation picture like a badge. It paraded snapshots from my classroom. The whiteboard behind me crowded with verbs and arrows. It had captions in my cadence and a biography that trailed me like a tail. The school, the degree, the apartment plants, the dog with the soft ears. The fake profile was sophisticated and convincing. It knew even the throwaway facts I rarely say out loud. The handful of details people use to feel like they know you. I scrolled until the room tipped a little. Someone was impersonating me online and targeting my family members. The imposter had already braided itself through the lives around mine, waving with my smile. The page showed conversations that never happened, apologies I never wrote, and requests I never sent. It used words I recognized and then twisted them like wire. I tried to be methodical. I made a list, took screenshots. I started documenting every interaction the fake profile had made. And the pattern was deeply unsettling. My uncle had been invited to a fundraiser that did not exist. A colleague received a complaint about our grading policy written in a tone I would never choose for a human being. The parents of 2 students were lured into a conversation about the school under the pretense of transparency, a quality I prize. A word that felt stolen when I saw it coming from the wrong mouth. I kept reading and found a sentence that felt like a bruise pressed on purpose. But when my own family started receiving friend requests from me and my co-workers began asking about posts I'd never made, I realized that my identity had been stolen and weaponized to create a parallel version of my life that was being used to manipulate everyone I cared about. That is what a bruise is, a record of contact. That is what a parallel life is, a record of someone moving close enough to steal your shadow. The mirror person did not stop with introductions. It began to talk. It issued opinions I do not hold. It flattered strangers and needled friends. The impersonator had sent friend requests to my family members, my co-workers, and even my students' parents, using our existing relationships to gain trust and access to their personal information. The grammar of harm was polite at first. May I add you? May I speak to you? May I have your attention? And then, inch by inch, it tried to become me. It posted small provocations and tall tales. Never so wild they would be dismissed. Never so mild they would be ignored. It knew exactly where to press. My principal called. Voice careful the way a person carries glass. The situation escalated when I received a call from my principal asking about inappropriate posts I'd allegedly made about the school. The imposter had posted criticism with my smile, sitting above the words like a signature. I stood in the office with my real phone in my hand and showed the quiet on my timeline. The absence of the very sentences I was now being asked to explain. Contradictions don't clear smoke, they only show you where the fire might be. I reported it. I contacted Facebook immediately to report the fake account. But their response was frustratingly slow. Watching the harm continue while waiting for a system to turn, its gears felt like standing on a curb while a car idled across the crosswalk, inching forward, daring you to step every hour. Someone else might accept a friend request from my face every day. Someone else might decide I was less than the teacher they once trusted. I went to the police. A detective listened and took notes. And the careful way she wrote told me she had seen this kind of bruise before. The police took my report seriously when Detective Johnson saw the extent of the impersonation. She called it by its full name, the way doctors do when they want you to respect the threat. This isn't just identity theft, she explained. This is targeted harassment designed to destroy your reputation and relationships. The level of detail suggests someone who knows you personally and has access to information that isn't publicly available. The diagnosis was its own kind of relief, cruel and clarifying. We learned how wide the net had been cast. The investigation revealed that my impersonator had been gathering information about me from multiple sources over several months. The Mirror harvested not only what I had consented to share, but what others had posted from their own cameras and living rooms. They'd even been using information from my school's website and public records to add authenticity to the fake profile. That is the unkind magic of social media. One photograph of you at a party does not belong to you alone. It belongs to the person who posted it, to the platform that stores it, to the stranger who screenshots it, to the ghost that will someday wear it. Then came the first sharp narrowing, but the breakthrough came when Detective Johnson analyzed the timing and content of the fake posts. The imposter referenced office conversations that had unfolded in the staff lounge and joked about a bulletin board only the English hallway would recognize, information that would only be available to someone who worked at my school or had close contact with someone who did. This narrowed the suspect pool significantly. I began to rehearse the faces of the people who moved through my days, searching for expressions that, in hindsight, might look like hunger. Evidence is a kind of gravity. Once it collects, it pulls. The case broke open when they discovered that my impersonator had been using the fake profile to gather information about other people as well. The mirror of me did not just smear my name, it extended friend requests like fishing line and hauled in the worry and generosity of people who knew me. Some shared phone numbers, addresses, fragments of security questions tucked inside birthday anecdotes. They'd been befriending my co-workers and family members, not just to damage my reputation, but to collect personal information about them for identity theft and fraud. I saw the shape of the plan: hurt me to get close to them, use them to build a bigger net. The detectives' team traced IP addresses and login windows the way a geographer traces a river back to its spring. Detective Johnson traced the fake accounts to Linda Morrison, a substitute teacher who had worked at my school intermittently over the past year. If you had asked me before this began which of my colleagues kept a map of my life, I would have pointed to the people I shared bus duty with. Not the person whose name toggled on the faculty schedule like a porch light, but resentment has a patience that looks like diligence from a distance. When the arrest warrant was served, the mirror cracked when they arrested Linda at her apartment. They found evidence that made my case part of a much larger scheme. On her devices were folders labeled with other names from our district. She'd been creating fake profiles for multiple teachers and school employees, using their identities to spread rumors, damage reputations, and even commit fraud. Drafts nested inside drafts, like boxes inside boxes. My name sat beside a file of planned confessions, ugly and precise. As if ruining me required choreography, she'd been building toward accusations that would have resulted in criminal charges and the permanent destruction of my professional life. I stared at the screen captures as if they were weather maps predicting the storm that, by some luck and labor, had turned and missed us. Courtrooms are rooms where the truth has to stand up and show its face. Linda Morrison pleaded guilty to multiple counts of identity theft, fraud, and harassment. The relief I felt did not feel like victory. It felt like air, finally finding my lungs after being held underwater. People think punishment resets the board. It does not. It pauses the game long enough for the injured to take inventory. In that inventory, but I found the quiet wreckage, a cousin who had been asked for money and felt embarrassed, a parent who wondered whether my curriculum was a soapbox, a colleague who avoided the lounge because the imposter had mocked their teaching in my voice. Trust once burned. Returns in cautious inches. I became a person who explained, over and over, that I am still the person they thought I was before a stranger borrowed my photo album and my biography. I met people in coffee shops and doorways and at the edges of events, repeating the same sentence in a dozen different ways until their shoulders loosened. The aftermath taught me the geometry of reputation. It is not a straight line, it is a web. Pull one thread and you feel tension in places you forgot were connected. I walked the hallways with the patience of a gardener who knows a frost can undo a season. And I watched my students watch me, gauging the weight of my silence and the sincerity of my eyes. I learned to speak about harm without centering myself in every sentence. I learned to say, with humility, that a system meant to keep us connected can also be turned outward like a weapon. What remains after the paperwork is a sharpened understanding of what was done to me. The scariest part wasn't that someone had stolen my identity, but let's say that phrase makes it sound like a credit card can explain a human ache. It was discovering that my entire online presence had been duplicated and weaponized to destroy my relationships and reputation. I keep coming back to the audacity of it. Someone had used my own photos and personal information to create a version of me that said and did things I would never say or do. That counterfeit moved through my circles like smoke, making everyone cough and look for a fire that wore my name, turning my identity into a tool for psychological warfare that damaged not just my life, but the lives of everyone who cared about me. So I built new habits, I locked down what could be locked, and I set up alerts that whisper when my name appears in uninvited places. I taught my family to verify through old-fashioned methods. I taught my students about digital consent and the ethics of sharing. I became a curator of caution, not because fear is wise, but because vigilance is a kind of love. When I walk into my classroom now, I still carry books and markers and the patience everyone expects of a teacher. I also carry the knowledge that a person can be framed by pixels and still step out of the frame. And when the night gets quiet and my mind replays the days when my name was a stranger, I remind myself of this. I did not choose the ghost that wore my smile, but I chose how to continue walking among the living. The people who matter learned to knock on my door, not on a profile picture. The rest can keep dancing with the mirror. I am busy tending the real. Story number 10. I thought a courtroom would feel like a finish line. It felt like an airport terminal, too bright, too public, and everyone watching where I might go next. I believed ink on court orders would act like a door that shuts with a decisive click. Instead, Those pages behaved like paper walls, visible, legal, and thin. I kept waiting for a day when my name would stop echoing inside someone else's plans. That day never arrived. It only changed shape. I learned that terror isn't always a sudden crash. Sometimes it is a careful filing system, a calendar, and a pocket notebook with my initials underlined. And I learned the hardest lesson last. The law can stop a person from stepping forward, but it can also invite them to stand and stare. I am a woman whose life once ran on listing appointments and escrow deadlines, on neat folders color-coded by zip code and school district, before the nightmare became institutional, before my mornings smelled like anxiety and burnt coffee, before I memorized courthouse hallways. I was simply someone who loved unlocking front doors and saying, "Imagine your life here." Then I met Michael Torres. He arrived as a file with a smile, pre-approval, a calm handshake, a tidy list of neighborhoods. He preferred me as his agent, said he liked my honesty and how I explained roofs and disclosures without drama. He asked about HOA fees, commute times, and what my other clients were doing in the market. He was so friendly I caught myself answering questions I should have deflected. Back then, I believed in polite conversation. I didn't understand that some people treat small talk like an intake interview. When the tours piled up, dozens of properties, I told my broker I wanted to terminate the relationship. He had stalled on every house. He had started asking to see homes near where I lived, and he wanted meetings that weren't meetings, coffee that wasn't coffee, and we sent a formal letter. I expected him to vanish. He didn't. He learned the rhythm of my days. I would find him at a grocery store, then 2 parking rows over at my gym, or ghosting the edge of a restaurant where I tried to smile through dinner. He never spoke. He watched. When I confronted him once, my voice steady, my knees not, the answer was a bland denial. That syrupy word, coincidental. That is when I asked the court for a restraining order, on paper. It looked like safety, 500 feet from my home, my workplace. And any place I stood, 2 quiet weeks tricked me into believing. Then the stalker outsourced himself. A man named James Rodriguez called me. He said he'd been hired for surveillance, meaning that he had been told to map my daily routine, to photograph my interactions, to log dates and exits and doorways. He quit. Conscience is a compass you hear or you don't. And he testified. A detective gathered the puzzle. Violations, harassment, the thin wire plan of a conspiracy to commit stalking by proxy. We walked that puzzle into a trial. I sat on a narrow chair and told strangers about sleepless nights, about the way terror can be tidy, about how lawyers can ask you to relive a moment until it no longer belongs to you. He watched me. He took notes. Sometimes he smiled like we were in on something together. The verdict gave me the smallest word, convicted, then the smallest number, 18 months with a promise of parole in 9. The judge said, sentencing guidelines are a fence. And because there were no broken bones and no recorded threats, the fence could not be moved. That day, I learned the first cruel arithmetic of safety. You can lose entire years to a person, and the law will call it a misdemeanor's shadow, a felony without force, a problem calibrated to what did not happen. Hooks burn fast, life smolders, and after the sentence, he appealed, while he wore a uniform that wasn't a suit. He sent for court documents that printed my details in black and white. He found paths, intermediaries, envelopes, holiday cards with neutral cover art. I received a form letter telling me he had been released. It arrived 2 days late. At this point, people often ask me, why didn't you disappear? As if safety were only a change of address. And I did move apartments, and I switched offices, made my social accounts into steel doors. But he learned the hinges of distance. He crossed state lines while staying within the lines, public sidewalks, social media, a camera lens borrowed by a private investigator I'd never met, a pattern he could defend as legal from 1,000 miles away. If you've never lived inside jurisdiction, you might think the law is a single room. It isn't. It's a hallway where local police tell you the door you need is 3 doors down, where the answer at the next door is, law enforcement over there can't act on this because it happened over here. It is a space that teaches you patience and carries a price. Your protection becomes a form you can fill out more perfectly each month. People ask about fear the way they ask about weather. Was it bad today? But fear is a climate, and it changes what you wear, how fast you move, whether you linger by a window. I bought curtains and better locks and a dog old enough to nap through anything but a stranger's shadow. I learned to step into courtrooms with my chin up, to answer questions without defending my tone, to let the words victim and safety sit in the same sentence without apologizing for either. One evening, after nearly 5 years of hearings and filings and the iron taste of waiting, he returned to Arizona. He approached me outside my new office. Crossing the space between us like a man late to a meeting was the last probation violation he would need to commit. The court didn't use the word mercy that day. It used 4 years. That is where most stories would end, but mine didn't. Because the end of a case is not the end of a memory. Because a locked door can still rattle in your mind. Because the victim notification system makes sure you will never forget the date the walls might breathe again. I wanted silence. What I got was responsible reminders. There are details people never ask about, but should if they don't ask how you keep a calendar when court dates shuffle like cards. How you keep a job when you may be asked to testify on a Tuesday and an afternoon becomes a biography. They don't ask how many lawyers you meet, how many multiple states you learn to pronounce like shorthand. They don't ask what it means to sit near an exit in every room without telling your friends why. I do not tell this story to warn anyone away from the legal system, but I tell it so you understand its architecture. The system is built to avoid harming the wrong person, and sometimes that caution harms the right ones slowly. It is balanced on justice as an idea, and ideas, like walls, have seams. When people ask what I want now, I say the obvious things. I want closure. I want to forget the way my keys feel when they are already in my hand. How metal can bite while you walk. I want safety to be opaque rather than see-through. But I also want vocabulary to change. I want us to say stalking and hear a timeline, not just an act. And I want testifying to feel like a full stop, not a comma. So here is what I do instead of forgetting. I teach other agents the questions you are allowed not to answer. I explain that the home buying process can be weaponized, that schedule and personal information are currency, that you can be a real estate agent who refuses to be a tour guide in your own life. I remind them that courtrooms are not the only places where we tell the truth. Every so often, a new form arrives in my inbox, a note about a hearing he has scheduled, a petition he has filed, a box to check if I want to be notified when the calendar rolls over. I check the box. I always will. This is not surrender. It is maintenance. Healing, for me, is not a destination. It is a list. I still walk through empty houses sometimes, for work and for memory. An afternoon light still finds the floors like it always did. I open a door and call out, imagine your life here, not to a buyer, but to myself. The rooms answer by staying rooms. The paper walls, for today, hold. And if the law is a hallway, then I have learned how to carry my keys differently. I no longer pray for a perfect system. I pray for kinder rooms inside it, rooms where someone like me can sit without rehearsing her fear, rooms where the word justice means the same thing in the judge's mouth and the victim's spine, rooms where closure isn't a myth, it's a well-fitted door. I am still here. He is somewhere else for now. Between us stands a chapter with a number in it and my name on its spine. It is not the ending I wanted, but it is an ending I can lift. And on the days when the past walks behind me at a careful distance, I do one ordinary thing very slowly. I lock my front door, take a breath, and begin to live in my own house again. Story number 11. I used to believe that danger announces itself. Now I know it prefers stationery and spreadsheets. Stranger didn't just study my life. He filed it, cross-referenced it, and offered it up like merchandise. When the phone rang, It wasn't a warning, it was an inventory check on the parts of me I hadn't realized were missing. Some hunters use rifles, mine used calendars, door codes, and birthdays. They didn't stalk me to see me, they stalked me to trade me. I learned the vocabulary of dread the way children learn the alphabet, one shape at a time, traced over and over until it felt inevitable. It began with a question from a calm voice that already knew the answer. Had I noticed anything odd? Anything that made me feel observed? Anything that suggested my daily life was not entirely my own? The voice belonged to a detective who had the patience of a librarian and the tenacity of a mountaineer. She didn't dramatize me. She asked for details like a surgeon asking for instruments. Exact and clean. Later I would learn her name had already lived rent-free in a file about me. But in that first moment, she was only a stranger who knew my middle initial. I stood at my window and watched the city breathe, the glass rehearsing every reflection it had ever held. And I tried to recall the last morning I'd felt unobserved. The answer refused to arrive. I had thought my life too ordinary for obsession. I wrote code, argued with compilers, wore the same jacket to the same corner market, waved at the barista whose tattoos changed more than the playlist. My rituals were reliable. I thought reliability meant safety. When the detective told me there were others, women who carried their lives like grocery bags, practical and heavy, I felt the floor of my routines shift a few inches, just enough to tilt everything I trusted. My habits had been a gift. It seemed predictable routes and predictable hours. A tidy calendar that made me efficient at my job and easy to index for a stranger's hobby. She explained what they had found without theatrics: binders, spreadsheets, labeled photos, annotated timelines. The language was administrative, the harm industrial, somewhere. Men catalogued women like postage stamps, rarities, duplicates, condition noted. The detective's tone remained even, but her questions revealed what the archive contained. Copies of my lease, notes on the angle of my living room camera, a sketch of the alley behind my building, shorthand that described my tired days with the clinical appetite of a lab manual. Some entries were wrong. That frightened me most. It meant they weren't observing, they were narrating. And my real life, my heat, my hunger, my boredom, was only raw material for their story of me. They had a name for their organization, I won't repeat it. Names are invitation. They recruited from message boards that looked normal until your eyes adjusted, like dark rooms where pain is coaxed into visibility. They taught each other how to be fog, how to hang in a place without forming anything someone could point at. If someone had to step back, someone else stepped forward. And the subject, never a name, always a subject, felt only a continuity of coincidence. I used to think paranoia was a leak in the mind. Now I understand it can be a map, sketched by someone else. Handed quietly to you with your own house, circled in red. I tried to think of the nights I'd walked home, believe and forget, my pocket carrying little more than lint and certainty. I tried to think of the faces that had slid past mine, of the cars that idled, of the polite questions that had seemed like kindness. I sat on the floor and counted logs. I told myself, control is a list you keep adding to. The detective told me something different. Control is a boundary that must be enforced by more than your own insistence. She promised the case had momentum. She didn't promise safety. No one honest ever does. Detective Sarah Chen stayed with the investigation the way a river stays in its bed. Sometimes slow, sometimes violent, always moving in one direction. She told me that in a small apartment in Portland, officers had found a topography of other people's days. A man with the pleasant anonymity of a tax form had been arrested. His desk contained a harvest. There were tabs for Seattle, for Vancouver, for Spokane, a cabinet labeled Pacific Northwest, and folders arranged by first names that were not ours, any more but theirs. In one folder, my life was calibrated like a device. Security settings, recurring meetings, places I bought bread, the dates I called my parents, or the model of my door lock. On a yellow sticky note, someone had written collectible cards in quotes, as if the phrase were both a joke and a mission statement. I sat very still and listened to my own breathing and thought about every room where I had ever felt alone. They practiced division of labor. Someone ran the errands of violation, someone else managed the database that made each errand efficient. One person's job was to watch doors, and another person's job was to watch screens. The detective said there was a chat log where men offered advice like recipes. Try this route, try this time, don't risk the front entrance, the back gate has loose hinges. The mundanity of their language burned hotter than any threat. They used bullet points to coordinate what they called coverage. They used ratings to evaluate how viable a subject remained after the first wave of attention. They joked about scarcity and trade. The tone told me everything about their sense of consequence. Zero. They were not supervillains, they were ordinary, which is worse. The ordinary has access to everything: flights, hotels, co-working passes, calendars, polite conversations, plausible excuses. Sometimes I think evil is less a mask and more a spreadsheet. Cells waiting for numbers that mean a person will be standing alone at a curb between 7:10 and 7:20 on Tuesdays. The detective said the apartment's walls had pinholes where maps had been rotated. In the trash, receipts for coffee and printer ink. In the browser history, a trail of tutorials on how to be less visible without becoming memorable. The most frightening material they had wasn't the photographs, it was the checklists of what they planned to do next. Kevin Walsh had a portion of my story pinned to his corkboard, but the detective insisted the corkboard was only a symptom. The problem was the network, an organism made of favors and surveillance that mimicked friendship. When one member had to vanish for a while, the network made sure nothing else did. The coverage continued, careful and quiet. They admired longevity. They admired systems. They admired the art of sounding concerned when asking a question that harvested an answer. One member coined a phrase for it: polite extraction. It sounded like a dental procedure because to them we were only teeth, aligned and replaceable. I was a 34-year-old software engineer, which meant I understood structures and failure modes, how small errors propagate into catastrophic ones if not handled. I looked at what they had built and recognized design patterns, redundancy, compartmentalization, a preference for data over drama. They were methodical. That day, something in me changed shape. I began to imagine my life not as a line, but as a system. And systems can be stress-tested. My first move was to close the windows in my calendar that anyone else could see. My second was to stop narrating my life for free. Privacy, I learned, is not secrecy. Privacy is the choice to decide what remains unnamed. They took more than comfort. Some used the information to commit petty crimes that were only petty because the ledger that tracked them was so large. Imagine harvesting the hours when your apartment is empty, the nights your lights stay off, the weeks you travel, the models of your devices. Imagine calling that inventory neat, stacked, useful. This was not only trespass against the self, it was logistics. Somewhere in a room that had never contained me. Men assigned me a probability of being home after dark on Sundays pitol, and that number dictated whether a door would be tried, a box rifled, a drawer rearranged. Loss did not arrive as chaos, it arrived as a plan. I gave the detective everything I could remember, the small alarms I had taught myself not to hear, the recurring car, the repeated face, the questions that landed a little too softly. I told her about the burglary I had filed under bad luck. She told me luck is often someone else's schedule. She was careful with my shame. Shame is a compass that points the wrong way. It directs you inward, when outward is where the fire started. So we went outward, we named rooms and routes and logins and laundry cycles. We treated my life like a machine that had been tampered with, and we diagrammed the tamper. They favored databases over diaries, and they loved daily routines, workplace directories, family trees, medical appointments picked up like coins in a fountain. I could feel the texture of their attention in my bones, how they would stand at the edge of a gym and look for patterns that settled like dust. I thought about the stranger who had held the door and asked which floor. I answered like a citizen of a friendly city. That day, I became a resident of something else. Friendship had to earn its name again. The arrest galvanized other jurisdictions. One apartment opened the others. One case note matched another. The detective began attending meetings that required more badges than I would ever collect. Emails multiplied, so did names. The map of what had happened to me widened until it resembled a weather system. Pressure moving silently across borders, accumulating and releasing itself in places no one had braced. It is a particular kind of fear to realize you were not chosen. You were assigned a primary operative because your predictable hours slotted neatly into somebody's timetable. It is a particular kind of relief to realize you are not alone in understanding this. They had been at it for 5 years. Membership whispering between 20 and 30 at any given time. Some considered themselves artists of attention, others technicians of opportunity. They experimented. They iterated. Their forums read like a trade school no one had authorized. At some point, they began to call what they did a service. At some point, they began to discuss monetization, which is the final stage of violation, to invoice the harm. They discussed identity theft, fraud, burglary, not as crimes, but as use cases. The way a product team talks about features before launch. One entry listed 8 months of a subject's recent losses and tagged it random break-in with a smile that wasn't on any face. When I struggled to sleep, I replay the briefing where the detective laid out the structure like a flowchart: intake, profiling, collection, escalation, trade, a network that had taught itself to be borderless because data is borderless, a network that had learned to be distributed because the easiest way to hide is to become many. It made a terrible sense. They prided themselves on not touching, as if touch were the only violence the law could see. They believed that if nothing broke in public, nothing had happened. So when the first indictments were handed down and men who had smirked in comments deleted those accounts in a flood of practical terror, I felt something like weather changing, not safety, not yet, but a reversal of pressure. Their target demographic was not complicated. Professional women, 25 and 40, living alone, predictable hours, generous online social media footprints. The cruel elegance of the criteria still makes me angry. It reads like a rental ad. For a long time, I couldn't forgive the part of myself that loved posting photos of a good morning view. Forgiveness came when I realized the problem is not that we live. The problem is that some people believe our living is theirs to reorganize. The law took its time and then it took its toll. Some pled, some argued, some invented new stories in which they were investigators themselves, rescuers, concerned citizens, gone overboard, and the files contradicted them, the receipts contradicted them, the chat logs contradicted them. Confronted with the thing they had built, a few confessed because an infrastructure that elaborate cannot be an accident. Others clung to performance. One man wore a suit that looked like a costume. One asked if the court would consider his contributions to local charities. One said he had only ever watched. I have learned to hear that sentence for what it is, a confession without the courage of its nouns. Kevin Walsh was one spine in the larger body, nothing more. He went away for 4 years and the body kept trying to breathe. Even during the investigation, fragments tried to recruit replacements from forums organized around misogyny, promising mobile apps that would make the practice scalable, safe houses that would make it local, fake businesses that would make it legitimate. The arrogance still startles me. To imagine there is any universe in which a company badge can sanitize obsession. What ended their momentum was not a change in appetite, but a change in risk. They ran the numbers. For once, women were not the only ones being counted. In the end, 23 men were processed into the grey machinery of consequence, 23 across 7 states, a number that looks clean until you realize numbers have shadows. For each subject whose name made it into a report, several others existed in drafts. For each room that surrendered a binder, another room hosted a laptop that never met a warrant. The detective still calls sometimes with updates, parole schedules, postponed hearings. A motion that has to be answered, so the paper keeps moving. I appreciate the formality. Procedure is tenderness in a world like this. It acknowledges that while feelings do not change the law must learn to respect the damage feelings measure.
I moved. I remapped my life. I gave myself a new mailbox, a new route to the corner market, a new calendar that breathes like a lung rather than announcing itself like a billboard. I changed accounts, habits. The trivial language I use when strangers ask questions that sound helpful. I taught myself to be less legible without becoming less kind. I am not hiding, I am editing. I tell my friends not to tag me. I keep joy intact by keeping its coordinates to myself until after the fact. Some days I am good at this. Some days I resent it. On all days, I know it is not my fault. That knowledge is not a shield, but it is a spine.
A therapist asked if I could name the scariest part, and I told her it wasn't the face in the crowd or the car under the streetlight. It was the discovery that they didn't view themselves as creeps in alleys, but as collaborators at scale. That they regarded harm as a project plan with milestones and retrospectives. It was knowing I had been shuffled between hands I never saw. That my life was an object in a market where supply was manufactured by attention. I do not believe in monsters. I believe in men who make spreadsheets and congratulate themselves on minimizing variance. I believe in the usefulness of boring evil. On good days, my world expands again. I add back small risks, the spontaneous dinner, the unplanned walk, the photo taken not for proof, but for pleasure. On bad days, I fold the map and sit quietly, counting the anchors that still hold. The friend who stays on the call until my door clicks shut. The neighbor who borrows sugar and returns it with a joke. The detective who refuses to turn people into paperwork. Even when the paperwork is all the court will accept, justice does not feel like a triumph. It feels like maintenance. The daily work of keeping weapons dull, sometimes out of habit. I search for the faces of the men who once searched for me. Curiosity is not forgiveness. See the way their lives now have labels they did not choose, and I do not rejoice. It is not my nature to enjoy consequence. I only insist upon it. They diminished their own futures. They did that to themselves. And when the calendar reminds me of another hearing, I feel the old fatigue return. But I answer the phone. I listen. I say what I remember. At the end of the call, I stand at the window and let the city rehearse its lights again. If you are waiting for certainty before you act, you will wait forever. If you are waiting for a threat to name itself, it will take your silence as permission. I know this now. I took back what I could take back. The ground under my feet. The air around my name. The gentle refusal to supply strangers with my itinerary. I am not fearless. Fear is not the opposite of power. Despair is. I live with fear the way fire marshals live with exits, counted and clear. And when I introduce myself to someone new, I try not to hear the scratch of a pen on paper. Some parts of me will always be listed somewhere I cannot see. I will not live as a list. The detective once asked whether I wanted to attend the hearing of a man who had once stood outside my building long enough to learn the rhythm of the elevator. I said no. Then I said yes. In the courtroom, I did not look at him. I looked at the diagram on the prosecution's screen, a rectangle for a room, arrows for movements, and thought about how diagrams cannot show intention, only motion. The man's attorney said he had merely been present. The prosecutor said, presence is not neutral when it rearranges someone else's breath. The judge nodded. There were words like parole hearings and conditions. terms and reviews. Afterward. I walked into the afternoon, unlabeled. I have kept one souvenir. It is not a file, it is an absence. I have removed my birthday from the platforms that believe it is the price of admission. My friends know when to surprise me because I told them privately. Private does not mean small, it means chosen. My name on the lease is not the name strangers use to search for me. I changed my name because I wanted to decide who gets to own the syllables I answer to. My old name still exists in rooms I will never enter, but it no longer opens any doors that lead to me. I end with this. The people who did this to me are not special. Their network was only as powerful as our habit of narrating ourselves to strangers. They once thought of me as a stalking network success story. Now I am an error message. When I speak to the detective these days, we talk less about cases and more about gardening. She grows tomatoes with the same stubborn hope she brought to my life. I like that. A garden is a system too, but it is a system that insists growth must serve the living. I am alive. That is not a closing argument, it is an opening.